And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. It's fantastic to have everyone here. It's already a huge crowd tonight, and I see some very familiar faces out there. As usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And this is quite a momentous evening we're coming to you on, because we're seeing this whole Brexit thing play out, and now they have announced that they're out. And so I know there's a lot of celebrations going on over there in the UK, and this is actually a good move, but also a portent, a kind of sign of things to come in a number of ways. Before we went on air, they announced that President Trump's impeachment was scheduled in the Senate for a vote on Wednesday, February 5th. Now, this is going to be a very important and interesting day for us to look at in terms of this episode, oddly enough. So these things are coming together nicely. The other little piece of unusual news, I guess you could say, is we're coming on air. It was announced that Zero Hedge had just been thrown off Twitter. And I'm not sure if it's related to this, but I had gotten something in my news feed from them literally just previous to that, which was all about this coronavirus. So we know there's lots and lots of things going on about the coronavirus, and it kind of plays into what the theme of tonight's episode is, which is this Armageddon syndrome. Right out of the gate, 2020 had all the earmarks of all the classic portents for Armageddon. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting thing, too, if you think about it. Right away, there was World War III with Iran, this, pandemic, and...
well, the locusts.
Yes, right.
In Kenya.
Yes.
That's crazy.
And that's an interesting story. Do you want to tell that story?
I don't know if it's much of a story, but it's the worst locust... I don't know what it's not an attack, but it is like one that they have seen in 70 years. And the locusts eat all of the edible food, and then there's starvation afterwards. So that's why it's so dangerous.
Well, it's fascinating. Of course, we know John the Baptist, when he was in the desert, lived on locusts and honey.
Yes.
So they must have their upside, too. It's pretty wild, though. I have to say that this episode... I started to think about a number of things that were coming together, and it made me realize that how momentous it is that we're at episode 80 of the X series, because this one, I can tell you, is going to stay in your memory for a long time, because there are things that we're going to reveal tonight that have never been aired anywhere. And it's going to be, I'm going to try to keep it all in this episode, but it probably is going to stretch into another episode, frankly. So, yes.
PV wanted to remind us that the Doomsday Clock also.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
The Doomsday Clock moved a little closer to midnight. This is a group of scientists who observe a number of factors and have been watching it ever since we got into the nuclear age as to how close we are to some kind of cataclysmic event based on our nuclear weapons, or man's inhumanity to the earth, whatever it happens to be. And they keep moving that clock, and they got real close this time. However, that can also move back, so it's not just on a roller coaster ride to 12. It can also be pushed back, for example, by fighting Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and getting him fired. That would probably move the clock back substantially. Yes.
I have been notified that there is a Dark Journalist T-shirt on Etsy that someone has created. Thank you. We were unaware.
Right. No, we don't make T-shirts, and we don't make hats and all the rest of it. But that's kind of interesting. And thanks for the tip. X Series 80, Armageddon Syndrome, Psychic in the White House, Jeane Dixon. Now, anyone who's watched the X Series knows that Jeane Dixon, I've called her the most powerful woman in the world at one point, because she had the direct policymaking ear of president on a number of occasions, especially in the case of Richard Nixon, who figures prominently in this episode, as you may imagine. Now, the 2020 tie-in with Jeane Dixon is that she made an Armageddon-style prediction, actually Armageddon, for 2020. But her interpretation of the term may be a little bit different than the straight biblical disaster thing that we attach it to. Some other interpretations of Armageddon in the past have also been interesting. For example, Edgar Cayce, America's Sleeping Prophet, saw Armageddon as the battle in the air between the souls coming to and leaving from Earth. And that takes you into a whole different realm of cosmology. The mystery schools were giving us some indication there that something major was happening here. I can also point out in Rudolf Steiner's work in anthroposophy, he singled out this period here, 1920 to 2020, is the rebound, where the mystery schools and anthroposophy get a chance again after World War I. 100 years down the road, it would come back around. So this appears to be the opportunity he was talking about. We also have something very unusual that I think ties together now, which is recently with the death of Houston Plan secret agent Robert Merritt, who worked for Nixon and was a confidential informant on the record for a number of different government agencies. It's interesting because in doing Merritt's story, something came out there, which was that he had heard from Nixon about 2020 being a calamitous year. And I'm going to read this to get us into the flow here, because that episode, which we put out after Merritt's death, kind of encapsulated everything about him and the secret message that he said Nixon had left in relation to UFO disclosure. Hey, we're off to the races already.
We are. There's a lot of ground to cover.
Absolutely. So this is now the quote, and this comes from Douglas Caddy, who wrote this on the Education Forum in describing something that Merritt had said. So now the president, here's Nixon. The president reiterated to Merritt that the contents of the letter were vital to the security of the nation. He remarked that if Merritt were to open the envelopes and offer its contents for sale, he could make millions of dollars. However, Merritt's record of past performance had convinced the president he could be trusted to deliver the envelope. This is the envelope containing this message that had to go to Henry Kissinger. And this is, all wrapped up in that story. And if you want more about what that is, just go, I think it's episode 78 there of the X series, Robert Merritt's Final Testament. Okay. It was then that Nixon made a cryptic remark, apparently to emphasize the importance of the assignment he had given Merritt. Nixon said, "I took my order from above and had followed it to the T." Merritt was taken aback by the remark and asked Nixon what he meant. Nixon did not reply, but instead declared the year 2020 would be cataclysmic, not only for America, but for the world. Merritt asked Nixon how he knew this would happen. Nixon replied, "Think of me, a prophet." Now, this happened in the summer of 1972. If we go back a little bit in time and rewind that clock just a little, we're going to find something very interesting in relation to Nixon. Because after all, this episode is about Jeane Dixon, who was the psychic in the White House, who was an extraordinary character, coming originally from Wisconsin, then Missouri, and finally ending up in California, where she would meet and marry James L. Dixon. And her actual name was Lydia Emma Pinkert. And whenever we get around the trail of her birth date and her birth time, there's always questions, and it's always a shifting story. For example, in some court cases, the date of her birth came out as 1910, whereas her siblings attributed her birth date to 1904. And finally, she had a passport that she produced for a reporter that said 1918, which is generally the date that she used. Now, there are reasons for this that are very interesting and unusual. And we're going to get into those because they make a kind of an important contrast to everything else that's going on here. Dixon was, according to anyone who worked with her, an astounding mystic and had that ability to use astrology, intuition, and was a seer of visions. No question about it. Years later, there would be all of these things that were ghostwritten for her. So she had a regular column, books about this or whatever, and she had become basically a kind of an industry. And so a lot of things that were attributed to her later in terms of like predictions that didn't come to pass or bad advice or whatever, kind of go more into that period of time. because when you look at the things that she came out on the record with, her batting average was unusually high. And I verified a number of things because there's a lot of misinformation about Dixon out there, suggesting, well, she did, it was a lot of fluff and she didn't really make these predictions. She's actually on the record more than a lot of psychics are, with big predictions that have to do with this, very sweeping events like the JFK assassination, the RFK assassination, home rule in India, and things of this nature. What's interesting is there's a little aside about a TV show that she attended, which we're going to get into, and where she was a guest, and there was a young co-host who didn't really have much of a role and was a sidekick, and her name was Oprah Winfrey. And Oprah Winfrey would remember years later that Jeane Dixon came up to her and said, "You're going to have an incredible career and be incredibly famous." And this was in '77 when she was just working on this local show. People Are Talking was the name of the show. And so I recently went back and watched that clip where someone had remembered that in the audience. But these are the types of things that she was known for. She had an extraordinary ability. There's no question about that. The question is, how did that ability get her to the very highest levels of power in the country and in the world on the political scene? And that takes us all the way back to 1944, where as a woman in her early 30s, she was taken as someone who could help President Roosevelt, because in the circles that she was in, and how she got introduced to those circles is fascinating, which we'll get into. But the circles that she got into had her set up on this fast track to the White House, where she gave President Roosevelt, FDR, some very bad news, which was that he only had 6 months to live, and whatever he needed to do it quickly. And so this was the beginning of that tie-in to the White House, but this would go on. And what I want to do tonight, as the kind of TKO, as we always like to start the show with a TKO. Everyone knows that she predicted the Kennedy assassination and tried to warn him. And she called into radio shows. There are a number of people that are on the record, newspaper reporters and otherwise. And so there are a number of them who have done this. And we can backtrack the record. It's very easy that she did predict that President Kennedy would be assassinated in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. Hold that thought. And so what happened was, when we go back and look at what was going on there, what's always been assumed is that she didn't have a relationship with John Kennedy. But in fact, tonight I'm going to show, for the first time, actual records from the JFK library that shows actual correspondence between Jeane Dixon and John Kennedy. And these are between 1961 and 1963. And they show a familiarity not only with each other and the subjects, but they also show a familiarity with her psychic ability. So she'll say things like, "I'm getting this vibration," and things like that. I mean, it's very this kind of conversation. There are some letters that are just plain like, check out this real estate, or do you know about this ambassador, or whatever it happens to be. But these records have never come forward because they were under the name James L. Dixon, which is Jeane Dixon's husband, which is where she gets the last name Dixon. As I said, her original name was Lydia Emma Pinkhart. And the Jeane part is very interesting because she becomes Jeane Lydia Dixon. But how the name change and the age change came about is quite fascinating, which we're going to get into. But I want to show first these breakthrough records that are from the JFK library and how they're just sitting in plain sight. I talk about stealth archives very often. This is a version of that, which is what we have here is there are a number of records and documents that are on the record that are sitting there. And I've mentioned, for example, the infamous X letter that's at the LBJ library, which LBJ said open in 50 years. And everyone had assumed, it's about Nixon because LBJ had bugged Nixon because Nixon literally bugged, as an eavesdrop. And one of the things that's often said about this is that he had on tape Nixon negotiating with the Vietnamese and saying, don't go for peace negotiations till I get in, I'll give you a better deal, prolonging the war and helping him get into office. That may very well be. However, there are a number, up to 30 pages in this envelope. And up to now, about 5 of those pages have been released, and they relate to surveillance of Spiro Agnew, who was in New Mexico during the surveillance. Interesting place to be. It seems to me, in going with exteganography and these various stealth archives that are left behind, that these things like the X letters in Eisenhower's X time capsule and a number of examples we've shown in this program relate to the idea that these presidents have been involved in working on the UFO disclosure issue and working with the X technology, and they want their role known when that gets rolled out. And so they're estimating out there. For example, in Eisenhower's case, his X time capsule is supposed to be revealed in 100 years from 1953. That's 2053. And then we have the 50 years with LBJ, and there's a series of stealth archives that go on like this. So there are these records that are there that we just can't get our hands on. But there are also these records that are sitting there that are in plain sight, and that we do have the ability, if we get a break or if we're diligent enough in our research and we have the time and the ability to do this. This is what happened here in the case of the JFK Library. Now, this is from William Moss, who was the chief archivist that worked, because Jackie Kennedy had set up the JFK Library. And as we know, a number of the Ernest Hemingway documents were brought there. Now, this letter is from November 9th, 1976. I'll read it and then I'll show it briefly. Memorandum for the record. I have this day screened the White House central name file marked Nixon, Dixon, J, we're going to get to Nixon later, Box 711, and have removed from it all correspondence to and from Jeane L. Dixon and her husband, James L. Dixon. This material may be opened to public research. Now, I think it's been missed all these years because all the letterheads are all James L. Dixon, but if you look to the bottom, they're signed by Jeane Dixon. And this is where the confusion came about, and no one ever bothered with it. So they never got into what was exchanged in these letters. Now, this one I found particularly interesting. Oh, I should show that one before we move along here. So that's this material for the file is open. That's directly, let's see if that even shows up. Well, it's a little dark, but I think you get the idea. This is available at the JFK Library. So all you have to do now is go to the JFK Library and look under JFK and James L. Dixon, and you'll find this correspondence. And like I said, much of it is very customary, normal back and forth stuff, but there's a few interesting hints in here for what we're doing. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here in X Series episode 80, and this one is taking us deep into Armageddon Syndrome 2020. We are looking at the role of the White House psychic, Jeane Dixon, who was enormously popular. Her book, The Gift of Prophecy, which was written by Ruth Montgomery now, but was all basically her biography. That book sold 3 million copies back then. So it was a master bestseller, and she was a huge figure. And I remember her when I was growing up because my mother had her books around, and my mother was very into astrology. And Jeane Dixon had this quality to her, I would say, which is she, right away, you knew there was something a little bit different about her.
She was incredibly charismatic.
Yes, you can definitely tell that. And she also, you know, it's fascinating because she has this Roman Catholic background, but she also believed in reincarnation and obviously her psychic work. So you have this incredible kind of back and forth in terms of the personality, and then things in her background that she didn't, you know, she knew enough in the era that she was growing up in and coming public in. You know, in the 50s, the 40s and 50s, you didn't say that you were divorced and then got into a new marriage, and especially if you're a Roman Catholic. But that's exactly what happened in the case of Jeane Dixon. So the secret's out, and we're going to get into that. Okay, so here is one on the letterhead. I'm going to read it to you. You'll be able, the lights are kind of bright in here. Let's see. Yeah, you just kind of get the idea. It's not showing up too well. Well, Well, as I said, the correspondence is available at the JFK Library. Just look under James L. Dixon. So this one is from July 26th. Let's take a look. Dear Mr. President, July 24th, 1961. Just a thought, but I think very important for the cause and results of which we are striving: better international communications and communion. Communion, as you know, has that connotation, church connotation. And so when she says what we're striving for, says that there's something going on between these people. It was my distinct honor to introduce America's Secretary of the Army, Mr. Elvis Starr, to Russia's #1 ambassador, Menshikov. When these two distinguished men shook hands, the vibrations I felt. She's giving this to the president. She's talking about her vibrations. I felt were that the distance between the 2 points of misunderstanding was shortened just a little. In other words, the more we approach an enemy, the more the tigers of the heart become lambs. That is, she's using quotes there. And there are verses in the Bible like this. I'm not sure if this is exactly a verse from the Bible, but it's interpretive of that, the lion lying down with the lamb. It is my thought and belief, she continues, now that all the appointments have been made, that it would be advisable to arrange a distinguished dinner of some kind and have all of the top appointees meet each and every foreign ambassador represented in America. Not only meet the ambassadors of each country, but also their military, air, and naval attaches. This is pretty high-level advice to be giving the president about how he should basically manage the relations between these countries. I feel very sure that such a plan would be helpful in annihilating the imaginary frictions that exist between our nations today. It would be nice to make this an annual affair. I know this has not been the procedure in the past, but there can always be a first time. It could, all in caps, prove helpful. If there is any way I can be helpful, for the need is seriously urgent, please call upon me. With my very best wishes to you and Mrs. Kennedy, in which my husband joins me, I am Jeane Dixon. Respectfully yours, the President of the White House, Washington, D.C. And this is her signature. So it's on file, as I said, so there's no questioning the document. So there we have her giving high-level advice to JFK. Now, if you look through her various biographies and everything else, you're not going to find it, because that was always kept out of the record. Everyone knows that she has this association because she predicted that Kennedy would be assassinated. And she had tried to warn him in this regard, and she had also predicted the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. So we're looking at something very powerful there in terms of her connection to it. But now we have on the record letters going back and forth. And the letters aren't just, one way. They definitely, there's one here that acknowledges from Evelyn Lincoln that she had given them a gift, and they're acknowledging the gift. I found this interesting. Dear Mrs. Dixon, now this is July 3rd, 1962. Thanks so much for sending in a photograph of the president that you had framed for him. He, of course, appreciated the kind thought that prompted this gift and was also pleased to know of your daily spiritual remembrances. And then, it goes on here, but she highlights Mr. James L. Dixon, President James L. Dixon and Company. That's a real estate company that Jeane Dixon's husband ran, James L. Dixon. And he is the one who took her from California to D.C. And as we'll find out, the reason he took her to D.C. was because he had very powerful roots through his family in D.C. that go all the way to Jeremiah Dixon, who made the Mason-Dixon line. And this is going to prove to be very powerful, because JFK himself, his final public appearances before Dallas and before his appearances in Texas take place at the Mason-Dixon line in Maryland at a ceremony. And this is all going to make a little more sense as we go down the road here. And I'm going to remind you, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. While we're talking about major news outfits like Zero Hedge being thrown out and off social media just like that, and that was quick, to prevent the spread of disinformation or real information, as it were. We can see that we're in a kind of precarious situation where they could easily zap us too. So
I've already been suspended once from Twitter.
Oh, that's right. That was over.
And now I'm shadow banned, I can tell.
Well, you've been shadow banned for a long time.
Well, I'm really shadow banned now.
It's worse than ever.
It is worse than ever. Ann Payne actually wanted to let us know.
Yes.
She tried to click the link in the email in the newsletter that was sent out, and the window said it was a malicious link. And so she had to come by way of YouTube to find us. So they find ways.
I know, Jeane Dixon is so malicious. It's pretty good. That is Kennedy, in fact, at that Mason-Dixon line. And he's there with some officials of the Maryland government. And this is November 10th, just 2 days before he will give the memo to the CIA director asking for all UFO information to share with the Russians, and especially the high-risk cases. And also, it is going to be just 12 days before he's assassinated. So this is going to kind of come into play as we go along here. And one of the things I wanted to point out before we go any further is because of all of this social media shutdown action that we're seeing, do go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. That's a free newsletter that's going to let you know everything we have coming up for you in terms of guests and all the incredible events and things we have coming up for 2020. And provided Armageddon doesn't happen, right? That's the way it goes.
Exactly.
I do feel that this picture of Kennedy at the memorial stone here, let's see. We're getting a lot of, well, it's just brightening it out, but it's very easy to go back and find this. And this stone is also very important. I'm going to cover that a little more as we get in there. And before I go any further, Miss Olivia, how are we doing out there?
Good. Scarlet Fire wanted to remind us that Dixon reportedly predicted the assassination of JFK in the May 13, 1956 issue of Parade magazine.
That's true. And if we want to really go into those details, it's fascinating because one of the things that happened in relation to that was Jeane had originally foreseen it in 1952 when Kennedy was actually a congressman becoming a senator, so really early on. Then in 56, she saw that the Democratic, basically, he was going to be the nominee for 1960, and he was young, and she described him to a T. And she said it was going to be a hard-fought election, but that he was going to win, but that he would die in office. And this got progressively deeper in terms of how she predicted it, because as I said, right up to the week of it happening, and even to the day, she said to people like radio host Long John Neville was pretty big back then, that this was going to happen. So it's on the record from multiple sources, and how she saw that goes again to her visionary ability. There was, this isn't one of those kind of fly-by-night predictions. She had it on the radar for a while. But the question is, in terms of fate, whenever we discuss these matters, you have to wonder if she can see something happening in 1956 or even 1952, and it doesn't happen till, almost 10 years later, 7 years from 56 and 11 from 52. How much of the future is set in that sense? As we know, Edgar Cayce predicted the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Was it just written on a blackboard? Or if things had changed, would they all just have been wrong? That would have been okay. We're moving on. Just like in some cases, people had predicted the destruction of California from earthquakes and inundation that hasn't happened yet. What's been changed? What took place to make that prophecy inaccurate? It's very interesting. So if we look a little bit at Dixon trying to get a handle on who this person is that is basically dictating America's foreign policy by the time she gets to the Nixon White House. This is quite fascinating because it turned out that there was someone who was researching for Newsweek the first terrorism sort of task force that was set up in the White House. And they were doing it post 9/11, and they were trying to figure out how it related to Bush's. And then they went back, and as they were looking through these records, they kept seeing Jeane Dixon showing up in this Nixon one after they found out, this was his reaction to a number of the things that had happened, like the incident in Munich. So she had now contacted Nixon and been in meetings with Nixon over 80 times. So she was a major contributor to this vision that he had for what was going to happen. She shows up on the Nixon tapes. And I always think this is funny because he's talking to Henry Kissinger, and then he's like, Rosemary, who is his secretary, who we're going to get into as well, because she, of course, is responsible for the famous 18.5-minute gap in those Nixon tapes. And Lord knows what's on that 18.5-minute gap, but it may pertain very much to what we're talking about tonight. But it turns out that she's close friends with Jeane Dixon and Ruth Montgomery. So, that's very interesting in terms of her role there. She becomes a very important person in Nixon's life because, one, she does the 18.5-minute erase job for him without it making it look like he has to go to jail for erasing it. She just did it by accident, apparently. And, anyone who's ever looked at this, it's the most ridiculous thing. However, she also shows up in a few ways as very interesting, because when we go back into some of these histories, we're also finding that Nixon gets all this advice from Jeane Dixon, and he's very close to her, and she helps him kind of give that vision of a new world and telling him, what's a good time to move forward with this policy and how the situation in the Middle East is going to go. But it turns out she, for years, has been giving advice to Governor Reagan in California. And it's quite possible that it's through these channels that she gets to Nixon, because it's never explained really, except that Rosemary Woods has something to do with it. So it's quite fascinating when we look at it from that angle. But Jeane Dixon, as I said, with the 3 different birth dates, right out of the gate, there's something unusual about her. And there's something to hide. And as I said, she had an early marriage to a Swiss immigrant. Not much is known about it, but it ended 4 years later. And she had the marriage in 1928, so that would make her 24. And then that would make her 35 when she marries James L. Dixon. What's interesting is in the traditional bio, there's this whole story about how she falls in love with James L. Dixon, but she's too young and her mother won't let her run off. And then he marries someone else, but then later he divorces her and comes back. So it's kind of a Hollywood story, but it doesn't have a whole lot to do with reality. And this was kind of that era, really, where, there was a cover story for everybody, pretty much. The presidents that she served now, FDR in 1944, telling him, you have 6 months to live. And the way she describes that and his response to it is so hardcore, in a sense, that you get this visceral sense when she does it. Then with Nixon, of course, her incredible role, which was uncovered really accidentally by this person going to look for a terrorism task force and finding her name showing up over and over again, and her many visits to the White House. And then finally, an incredible role in guiding President Reagan after guiding him as governor, which got him into a lot of trouble at a certain point because, it got out that he was talking to psychics like Jeane Dixon and astrologers like Joan Quigley. But even the presence of Joan Quigley is very interesting. And of all things, People magazine came out with a pretty heavy profile of this whole Reagan and astrology situation in May of 1988. And they uncovered something quite remarkable, which I printed out here, and I'm going to read to you shortly. Okay. How are we doing out there?
We're doing great. You're going to have a lot of questions all over the place.
I know. Trust me. I have a lot of questions too. Okay. So just a quick recap now. The JFK documents and correspondence with Jeane Dixon, which has never been on the record, probably because of how they were cataloged by Jackie Kennedy Onassis at that point, chief archivist, they were sort of put under this James L. Dixon, and no one ever caught on that that was the same Dixon. But if you look at the bottom of those letters, we have Jeane's signature, and it's obvious the way she's talking about the things with Kennedy, that she is going to, get these vibrations from shaking a Soviet ambassador's hand. This is Jeane Dixon. But I think it's important, and we should keep it in mind, that these types of breakthroughs and these things are hovering right on the edge there. And I do call them stealth archives. Sometimes we do get our hands on them and it moves the story forward. I think there's a lot that can be drawn from this, because if you look and we go through the history of Jeane Dixon and Kennedy, this is important that they had a regular correspondence relationship. And even if a number of the letters are just mundane back and forth, we saw there are a few already that show her talking about how to improve relations, and they're really advice-oriented, and there's a kind of familiarity there. So one thing I want to get into is, oddly enough, President Trump comes into the story a few times, but let's take him in this way. So on February 5th, 1962, Jeane Dixon has this incredible vision that opens up, and she sees Osiris, or she sees Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and this is the famous pharaoh, and we all know Queen Nefertiti, and how they had kind of created this whole different thing in a golden era in Egypt. But then through a revolutionary means were driven out of power, and King Tut was their son. And, we got this whole thing about King Tut later when they found this incredible sarcophagus and tomb in 1922 through the efforts of archaeologist James Carter and Lord Carnarvon. There was the whole thing about the Pharaoh's curse and all the rest of it. But it is incredible, and it did tour the U.S. What's interesting is that Tut is gearing up for a new tour of the U.S.
I did not know that.
Which is quite interesting. But it just so happened that they're in the 70s that they really came out with this and really pushed it. But here we are, 1962, Jeane Dixon has this incredible vision, and she sees this incredible sort of liberation figure coming from this union of Nefertiti and Akhenaten. So it's a really heavy-duty vision that's there in the gift of prophecy. Now, the upshot is that somehow this whole thing, though, brings about what she would describe as the Antichrist, because she's using very biblical language, Armageddon, Antichrist, these types of things. And as it turns out, this psychic vision becomes kind of a good thing and a bad thing. And that's what her Armageddon 2020 prediction is like too, because it opens the door to this entire future, but it also requires a war between good and evil. Now I'm going to read a few passages about 2020 directly from her own book, so from her own words. The book is The Call to Glory, and it's by Jeane Dixon. That's her picture there on the back cover. It is 1971 that the book came out. I do recommend it, and you will get a real strong sense for her religiosity when you read this. Yes.
Show everybody the signature.
Oh, yes, yes. This is a remarkable book, and it has the actual sign-off, as it were, from Jeane Dixon.
I think that's so cool.
And it's interesting, too, that, and it's Happy Birthday 1972, and it says God's blessings. Now, what's interesting is if you look at that signature and you look at the signature on the Kennedy letters, you can easily tell it's the same signature. So it's quite remarkable when you look at it that way. So let's take a kind of a trot into her prophecies here. She's going into the Armageddon, the field of Armageddon, as she calls it. So she says, quote, "As I've indicated, in 2020, we have now reached the time focused on by St. Matthew, Daniel, Isaiah, and Micah, and again, St. John. The Gospel of St. Matthew continues," and she quotes these long passages. And there's a lot of that. If anyone tells you at the time, look, the Messiah is here or he is there, do not believe in it. False messiahs and false prophets will appear. And there's a lot of this theme when she's talking about it. And then she says, in relation to this period, deliverance from the reign of the Antichrist can come only from the continuing intervention of God. Well, that's putting it real. His power is so great that, quote, it forced all men, small and great, rich and poor, slave and free, to accept a stamped image on their right hand or their forehead. Moreover, it did not allow a man to buy or sell anything unless he was first marked with the name of the beast or with the number that stood for its name. And we know that later they say that this is where the 666 comes from. And so in the Revelation, it's quite remarkable. And there's a lot of different interpretations of what this could be. But there's no question that something about this stamp on the hand giving the incredible push for transhumanism, there's a real echo there in the biblical language that calls to us now. I think it gives us some recognition that whatever, this revelation of John, whatever he was seeing was somewhere here in our future. So, and also it did not allow a man to buy or sell anything unless he was first marked with the name of the beast or with the number that stood for its name. That's pretty good. Okay, so she continues, again, using very heavy religious terms. The Antichrist, now in full command of the world, is the abominable and destructive thing, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. Like Daniel, I see the vision become indistinct after that, as the dreaded number 19 changes to 17, beginning the new 17-year cycle. The year is approximately 2020, and in the years immediately following, the Antichrist disappears. The years 2020 to 2037 approximately hail the true second coming. And then she goes on and on from there. Now, moving down, so she goes on to say that, the things that inner city problems will go away and the cities will become fantastic places and a number of environmental problems will be alleviated and so on. And all very kind of modern language, oddly enough. When I was reading this, I was thinking anyone could have written this for 2020, but this is 1971. The world's population will increase slowly again after the horrendous and devastating experience of Armageddon. 2020, Armageddon. This is what she's saying. The Malthusian problem will not recur. The discovery of marvelous new metals, materials, and sources of energy, atomic, cosmic, magnetic, will not only revolutionize life and industry, but will make it possible to engage in space travel of distances that are inconceivable now. When we go and we look to Merritt's exchange to Nixon, this actually, it feels like this. They're all speaking the same language. It's related to space. It's incredibly advanced, and the 2020 part. So that I find very, very interesting. Now, how about this? Let's see if this opens some things up. Marvels of the human brain will be understood. Cybernetics will be developed in ways that would now baffle the mind and stagger the imagination.
Wow.
It's quite remarkable. A loosely knit form of democratic world government will oversee world problems, while each sovereign state will maintain its identity, much as the American states do, or as countries which were members of the British Commonwealth of Nations. The new Commonwealth of States will be worldwide. Regulations of trade will be nominal, and she goes on. And so she talks about this in such great detail, and I could go on with it, but 2020 is quite remarkable. And so what she says at the end of this vision is, I see the end and the beginning, a new era, a new life, a new world. So great destruction, and then something great comes after that. So it's something else to put yourself on the line like this. She must have figured out that someone like me would be looking at this many years later and saying, hey, was she right or was she wrong? But she got it. And now let's take it a little bit further as we look at this kind of syndrome of Armageddon that we're talking about, because there have always been these movements. We remember 2012 was one where it was supposed to be all this upheaval and the end of the world was predicted by the Mayan calendar. But there is, however, something quite remarkable going on, even if we kind of resist this idea of this great destruction and reset. In the Casey readings, he often talked about earth changes, and he talked about, how there would be a new entire wave of people, and they would be conducting their trade over many of the battlefields of today will be the bays and the oceans of which they do their trade. So that sounds like a real major heavy-duty bullshit. So these things are out there. So what do they mean? I mean, are we lined up for incredible destruction? Are we, have all these wars and rumors of wars coming out there, and they've just gotten out of all these nuclear treaties. So there's something about 2020 that has this echo. I'm not much of a fear porn person, and I don't go down those roads. But I will say this, that there's some message about the time, which is coming from a number of different sources. And it's been my experience that it's actually the mystery schools who leave those threads, so we'll find them. So there's definitely something afoot, and if we can get our hands on it, if we can get conscious about the wave that's upon us, and a number of these predictions, then I think we'll be looking at ways to avoid those types of fates, for example. But it's also very important, I think, to understand what's on the record and what kind of message that we're getting. In this case with Dixon, who was such a high-level figure in giving advice for presidents like Reagan and Nixon, this isn't somebody who was just kind of a flake who believed in astrology and vibrations. She's giving advice for years. If you think of her first advice to Roosevelt, this 1944, and when the scandal hits with Reagan, that's 88. How many years is that? That's 44 years being on that high level. And now we've proven without a doubt that she's corresponding with Kennedy. So this isn't somebody to take lightly in this sense. I'm not saying that her predictions are all correct or anything, but I think we're getting a hint here from a number of different sources that something is afoot. But it's also remarkable too, because it seems like there's something in the zeitgeist which is egging us on in a way to destruction and showing, the kind of normal channels of society with transhumanism and these incredibly bizarre things that we're seeing in society. It's almost like the destruction of the paradigm of progress in that sense. And it's going into this kind of freakier reality. Let's see what some of the roots are, though, maybe behind some of this. So while I switch over, Miss Olivia?
Blazon River wanted to know, did Jeane Dixon ever speak of Earth or solar events?
Yeah, there's solar events in some of her predictions. She certainly talked about earthquakes. Some of them came to pass, and some, like I said, her batting average was pretty good. It seems like later it suffers, and I feel like that's part of when she has ghostwriters and moving toward more the end of her life. There's a lot of things that are just like, she was part of the kind of tabloid world in a number of ways by then, but that was just the fabric of being a celebrity who did that kind of thing.
What about pandemics?
Well, I'd have to check the record on that, but certainly in the Gift of Prophecy book and Call to Glory, that's where she's projecting out into the future. And she talked about them, but I don't know if she talked about one in terms of like wiping us out. One thing that it seems she had a very interesting kind of influence on President Nixon on is something that I want to call crucial in all this, in which I pointed out in one other program, something called Nixon's Pyramid. Now, what we're going to have to get familiar with Jeane Dixon to really understand what's going on here is her connection to Jeremiah Dixon through her husband, James L. Dixon. Now, in his past and in his background, we have a number of Dixons that are related to this archeology, astronomy family. And it's quite interesting because his connections in DC make a lot more sense now that we've looked at it from that angle. Let's take a quick look at the work of Jeremiah Dixon and tie it into something extraordinary that took place in Nixon's resignation and in his subsequent pardon. This is such a major piece of what we do here with the X series that it's great to have it be in episode 80. It just so happened that way. But let's get back into this idea of bicentennial for a minute. So the bicentennial of America was the 200 years since the revolution. It was 1976. Nixon was supposed to be president during this period. But it turns out because of the scandal, he had to resign in August of 1974. Now, it will be about a month before President Ford pardons him for all crimes, not just Watergate, but for anything. That means if he knew anything about...
What do you mean for... You could just do a broad spectrum...
like a blank
it's all
slate.
forgiven.
Yes. So
wow.
if you have anything you can even vaguely relate to his crimes, he now is a clean slate. So if he was associated with anything that the CIA could pull out and say, it wasn't us who did the JFK thing.
That's
we have
crazy.
some document. Yeah. It's
Your
quite
karma's
interesting.
wiped clean.
But I do feel that the pardon is interesting, and we can kind of take a look at that on its own. What I want to do is take a look at that pardon in relation to the ancestors of James Dixon, Jeane Dixon's husband. So let's take a little time out on this to do that. As I pointed out, President Kennedy was there in one of his final appearances now, November 10th, at the Mason-Dixon line doing the ceremony. But this was the bicentennial of the Mason-Dixon line because it was 1763 and this was 1963, 200 years later. Watch this bicentennial dot move around as we go through this. And then also weigh in and notice this term horizon when I bring it up. Because there's something that Nixon has called the Horizon Project around the bicentennial. And it's very unusual because the Horizon Project doesn't want to go back and say, hey, let's go celebrate the original revolution. What it wants to do is it wants to say, we're having a new revolution and it's advanced technology and it's advanced science and it's all the rest. And this is very interesting because Nixon, as I said, was meant to be there when the centennial happened. It was an election year, but it would have been his vice president, Ford, who would have been running. Instead, he was out. Ford was already president and would lose in that election to Jimmy Carter because Ford had pardoned Nixon. But this was obviously all part of the deal because Nixon wasn't going to take the fall completely. He knew he had too many secrets on the government. Now, on September 9th, 1974, the first thing that Ford does after he pardons Nixon on the 8th is he shows up at a tiny elementary school in a place called Moon Township, Pennsylvania. And in fact, the school is called Moon. These are a series of pictures of President Ford showing up in September of 74, his first public event after pardoning Nixon. Now, the power of what you're going to do when you have just made a major decision as president to pardon a president that had been convicted in the public imagination and had resigned, but still a number of charges could have been brought against him. What happens is, you're in a position where you need to project all of these different things, international authority, why you did it, and all the rest of it. That Ford shows up at an elementary school in a little place called Moon is very unusual. Let's take it from there. Now, it turns out that this township is quite remarkable for a number of reasons. I want to show you this article. And the headline of this article is, Time Capsule Reveals Bits of Life in the 40s through the 70s. This is in the Pittsburgh Gazette, and I should say that Moon is within the metro area of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. And it looks quite nice from the number of pictures I've seen. But let's track with this article and get into why Ford may have been there right after pardoning Nixon. And how, when we look at the Dixon-Nixon combination, the real links between them, we might find something here. Quote, the demolition of the former Carno Elementary School in the fall was watched by many, but perhaps none more intently than Ruth and Clyde Meener, who had lived near the school in Moon. The couple graduated in 43, and it goes on to talk about it. And then it says, as the Meeners witnessed the alma mater being dismantled in September, they watched closely when crews proceeded to the demolition of a section of the building where a time capsule had been entombed more than 60 years ago. That capsule and a second one that was buried on school grounds during the nation's bicentennial in 1976 were opened February 10th as part of a groundbreaking ceremony for the new high school. And then they go off talking about this. Dale Gass, 84, a Carno graduate from the class of 1942, said Ms. Meener had asked him to open the time capsule, but he wasn't up to it. Once it was sealed, someone named James Reed used a machine that pumped the air out of the capsule through a little hole, and then he sealed the hole, Mr. Gass said. The capsule was sealed in concrete inside the foundation of the school in 1942. It was encased in an artillery shell that was lodged in a load-bearing wall underground when additions were being done to the building, which served as the high school for Moon students. And he goes on to describe it. Now, as we go through this kind of general description he's giving, he says the contents of both time capsules will be placed on display in a glass case in the high school. Eventually, both capsules are to be reburied with a time capsule from 2010. Okay, so one hint that we have here about this school, which is that it had this time capsule and then it had a bicentennial time capsule associated with it. Now, next up, as we're going along, this is Moon again. This place has had a series of presidential visits to it. Many presidential visits, for example, President Gerald Ford made a surprise visit to Moon a day after pardoning Richard Nixon, September 9th, 1974, as we just noted. In 1994, President Bill Clinton greeted then Prime Minister John Major of Great Britain at a hangar, the 911th Air Wing of the Air Force Reserve in the Pittsburgh International Airport in Moon Township. A day after securing the Democratic nomination for president, then President Al Gore held a rally at Moon's high school gym, March 16th, 2000. Moon is an incredible place. This is a very small place to have this incredible list of dignitaries visiting.
Is there a Mason Lodge nearby?
Well, there's a few, but I will say this. There's a couple more sort of bombs to drop on this. All right. In September of 2009, President Obama visited Pittsburgh for the G20 conference going through Moon. Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump held a rally on June 11th, 2016 at the Moon Township airplane hangar. So, list of presidents: Clinton, Nixon, Ford, first appearance right after he pardons Nixon, Obama, Clinton, and Trump. Now, as it goes down the line, there may be, more visits we don't know about, but at least we have those. The township has a total area of 24 square miles. So the demographics is that there's about 22,000 people there. Why is every president of the modern era going to Moon? Let's think about that.
Tessa1111 wants to know, is it on a ley line?
Well, that's a good question. There are people who study ley lines who, I have a different idea about why they're going, but it's certainly possible. I couldn't say for certain. So there's a few things about Moon. Let's just spend a little time on why these people may be going to Moon, and then double back to Ford's visit there, because it's going to come in handy with everything that we're looking at.
Can I throw one more thing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So Furber Fighter said something great. Thomas Pynchon's novel, Mason and Dixon, brilliantly proposes that their line ruined the feng shui of the USA.
Well, this is really interesting. Actually, it makes me think of the work of Walter Bosley, because he talks so much about these telluric currents. And he was talking all about how they had all these postal routes on these currents and stuff. So that's going to get right into a deeper part of the Dixon lineage and why this all comes about, and why her access to Washington may seem so easy, in a sense, that she just sort of floats in and starts advising these presidents. It's going to make sense if we understand James L. Dixon and his background, not to take anything away from Jeane, but because obviously she had to do incredible seership in order to do this. But this may have been kind of a sort of a fated meeting, shall we say, of the two of them, James L. Dixon and Lydia Emma Pinkert, who became Jeane Dixon. Now, a couple of quick things about Moon. Moon Township is a township along the Ohio River in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. Moon is part of the Pittsburgh metro area and is located 12 miles northwest of Pittsburgh, very close. Pittsburgh, a number of very interesting things have come out of Pittsburgh, of course. The initial settlement of Moon Township was a direct result of the westward expansion of English settlers. Now, there's a big, broad overview here, but the thing I'm going to sort of zoom in on is that when we get to Moon, a lot of weird things happen, which is at a certain point, the military moves in there and starts calling everything after the moon. Like, you know, they have crescent moon, half moon, and they start describing all these things. And then U.S. Airways opens up there in 39, and so the international airport for Pittsburgh is close by. That's kind of what Moon is very famous for. Now, what I found particularly fascinating is the motto of the town is "Explore our universe." So now
we're like a little town.
We have a little town called Moon. We have this strange visit by Ford, which seems to kick off all these other visits. Now, I've gone back, and I haven't found them visiting Moon before Ford. Yes, what do you got?
Matute11 says, there is a portal in Moon. It's a great theory. I love it.
Well, you know, I think we're going to boost the township population just by talking about it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here going deep in X Series 80 on Jeane Dixon, and we're taking an interesting detour into her family's past to get a hint of what might have been going on with her incredible entree into these political worlds, of which she became so famous with her remarkable predictions. Now, one thing I can say in relation to Jeane Dixon is that by searching through the records and getting the facts, I can tell you unequivocally she predicted the deaths of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, and also predicted the assassination of Gandhi. There's something very interesting about her ability to do this. I'm also going to tell you that she was used by the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover basically for the same reasons that Nixon was using her. So this is somebody who was operating on a very high level and using her skills and intuition and her psychic ability to gain this entree into these worlds and to make a huge difference. Because when you look back, as we look at things like the Nixon pyramid, which I'm going to show here shortly, we're going to really see that Jeane Dixon had this incredible impact on the world. And that I think it's very fair to say that at a certain point, she was the most powerful woman in the world. And I don't say that as like, she's so powerful and she commands all this, political power by, I don't mean it in a negative sense. I literally mean that her ability to have the ear of these presidents and to use her psychic abilities to give them access to information they don't have gives her, I think, this mantle for a while when she is having this incredible relationship. Now, here she is with with Nixon at a function. Now, this is in 1972, and their relationship is very well established by then. And I think we get an idea right off the bat of the kind of deep chemistry that the two of them had. Now, a couple of interesting things, and I'll get back to Moon, I promise. I won't leave us hanging on Moon. But just to bring in a little bit of a UFO aspect here that ties them in. First of all, Jeane Dixon was a believer in extraterrestrial civilizations, and she thought that we would adopt a interplay with them and that it was going to happen. It was something that there's a whole wave inside the Nixon administration for UFO disclosure. He funds a UFO disclosure documentary, in fact, and the director, Bob Emenegger, is the one that they will hire, and it'll come directly out of the White House to have him do this. And he will set them up with DOD and give them UFO footage and everything else. And then at a certain point, Watergate happens, and they have to pull plugs on some of it. And so the documentary comes out eventually, and it has Rod Serling from Twilight Zone doing the narration, which is pretty good. And there's some weird stuff, like Burgess Meredith is in there doing it too. And
well, he narrated everything.
Yeah, exactly. But I find it interesting when we look back at this period, because this push that's going on matches very closely with what we were getting in terms of information from Robert Merritt about Nixon and UFOs. But even without that, we've got Nixon making plans to bring this forward. Now, there are stories in the period about Nixon developing an alternative energy source at Pine Gap because they were facing something called the Arab oil crisis in 1973. Nixon is not thinking about Watergate and these types of things. He thinks probably he's going to get out of it. And what he's moving toward before Watergate really takes him down is he's going to be the president during the bicentennial. And it looks clear that he's going to announce something, because he takes the bicentennial and he turns it into the Horizon event. And the horizon is what's coming up. And what's coming up is all this advanced technology. And as you can see in the little remarks that Jeane Dixon is making in the book, you're not going to believe the kind of things we're going to have for space travel and all the rest of it. So then she makes some very unusual comments about how these ships are here and that they're from off-world civilizations and they're observing us, and that she can see that there's going to be some kind of a meeting of the minds between the population and these things. And she really goes to bat for the whole UFO issue. Now, when we think about her relationship to it, we have to start to wonder where is she getting that information? And basically, Nixon, as we know, has that great background on UFOs. But she also had an incredible relationship for years with a Southern senator named Strom Thurmond. Now, this is very interesting because a lot of people who are familiar with The Day After Roswell and Philip Corso's book will remember that he worked for Strom Thurmond. And in fact, his book, The Day After Roswell, originally had a foreword by Thurmond before there was a controversy, and they had to pull it. And actually, that original version, which you still see copies floating around now with his intro in it, and he's talking about how incredibly honest Corso is, and how Corso had this incredible reputation, having served Truman, Eisenhower, JFK, and Nixon. And his closest friend in this political milieu, and who he would go on to, eulogize her because he had outlived her. He would go on to say she was the most remarkable psychic that he had ever met. He went right on the record with it. So there was no hiding their relationship. But the thing about Thurmond, I believe, that we have to keep in mind is Corso. Because anyone who knows the history of Philip Corso, he was the one who said that they would do crash retrievals They would analyze the properties, and then they would resell the information to corporations to develop it. And that we got a number of things, everything from Velcro to bulletproof vests and microcircuits, microprocessors. So these are the things that Corso was putting out there. And it's interesting too, because when we think about Corso, a lot of the UFO world tried to throw him off. And in fact, when he came out with this information, he was sued from a number of sources. And it didn't do him any good to have this information out there, as his son, Philip Corso Jr., goes around and will remind everyone. But in my conversations with Joseph Farrell, he believes, and I think anyone reading the material, as Catherine Austin Fitz has said this as well, that Corso was telling us something very important in his work, in that book, The Day After Roswell, and that basically the publisher kind of schmaltzed that message up by really tying it heavily into the alien craze at the time. But he was saying that he had briefed JFK and RFK and on the UFO issue, and that they had built the X-15 with the X technology under Walter Dornberger to chase these things. And remember that the Dornberger X-15 plane, which figures so prominently in some of the X-series episodes, is still holds the record for a manned space plane, even though the tests were done in the 1960s. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? So what kind of technology were they using before it went black? It had this name X-15. So that gives us some idea of the UFO sort of milieu around Dixon, Nixon, and Strom Thurmond was right in the heart of it, because Corso was in charge of the Foreign Intelligence Office and the Foreign Technology Office. That's where they reactivated and did tests with some of that material from UFO crash retrievals. That's where the UFO file had one of those government agencies that it went through. So when we think about this, we're really getting a picture here of her place and how this UFO secret was carried by these very high-level people. That brings us also along to her relationship with the Reagans. And it's quite extraordinary because, as I said, that relationship goes all the way back to the early 60s. And she was recorded, although not having as many visits as she did with Nixon, she was a major sort of force with Nancy and Ronald Reagan, and that Reagan specifically wanted her to combine this astrological forecasting with her psychic prophecies. So he believed very much in her abilities, having known her for those years. That tells us a lot too, I believe. And I want to make a little detour here to this article that I mentioned, and I mentioned this on Twitter too, because I knew, I was like, people are going to say, he's putting up something from People magazine. There's got to be a good story behind this. By the way, before I do that, Hal Roach, who was business partners with James L. Dixon and was a really kind of an early innovator in Hollywood. He made a number of kind of successful movies. And Hal Roach Studios became something very kind of powerful. One of those movies that he made was something called Starship Invasions.
We have to see that.
So when you look at the sci-fi here, wow, the imagery is clear. Now, when we go into this, it's kind of fascinating because Roach, being Dixon's husband's partner, again, his fascination with sci-fi, I keep an eye on it. A couple of quick things about Jeane Dixon before I go into the Reagan stuff is that she was one of 10 children born to German Catholic immigrants, Gerhard and Emma Pinkert. I've tried to go further back in that line to see what was going on with the Pinkerts. But certainly there's kind of an affluence to them. I can tell you that right off the bat. And they are a family of blacksmiths. Now, I'm going to tell you why this is fascinating. And this is an interesting personal anecdote, but there was a NORAD officer named Stan Fulham who made a prediction about a series of UFO sightings over New York City on October 13th, 2010, the sightings were supposed to happen. And I caught wind of this that September. And, but basically, oddly enough, the UFO prediction came true. There were all these sightings over New York City on October 13th, 2010, and you can still find some of that footage. And it was a remarkable thing that happened there. Now, in a follow-up, I had planned to talk to Fulham about this, even though I wasn't working as dark journalist at the time. I was working for a lifestyle technology magazine. And so we were going to do it. He died literally within a month of that. So it happened in October and he died in November. And then it turned out that there was a group that had given him the prediction called the Transcenders. And I was like, this is pretty interesting. But the Transcenders were basically this guy named Rick Thurston, who was a psychic along the lines of like Edgar Casey, using these types of methods. And what he had told me in some like 15 hours of conversation channeling these Transcenders, he had given me this very interesting overview about off-world civilizations and what they were doing here. And I kept a very open mind when I listened to him because he was a remarkable guy. And but one of the interesting things that he said, which I had never seen anywhere, was that the big alien sort of connection here on Earth was through these blacksmiths in the Middle Ages. So I always found that quite fascinating. So when I ran across that reference to Dixon, whoa, the radar went off the chart.
There were a couple of people asking earlier whether Jeane Dixon may have been Vril. She is German.
Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah. I think her abilities say that something sort of extracurricular was going on there. And, one of her sisters was an aviatrix, very much like Amelia Earhart, and she had a brother who was a famous football player. So it's definitely a powerful family. Why they moved to California isn't clear. The period when they're in Missouri is very interesting also. It's not well known. But I think it's important when we look at Jeane Dixon and some of these background pieces to keep in mind that her husband and his background with the Dixons and the way that they have this incredibly rich history in America coming from England. And they were a deep, deep part of the Masonic lineage that was happening there. And they became, the Dixons, very famous for doing things like bringing Cleopatra's Needle out of Egypt. And I'm going to get into a little bit of what they found. But what I want to do at this point is I'm going to move into this article on Ronald Reagan. But Miss Olivia, while I'm doing that, what have you got out there?
The Observer wanted to know, did Dixon hear a voice or was it just a knowing? Did she ever reveal how her information came through? I know she had that.
They're visions. They are.
In the crystal ball?
Well, it's interesting. The crystal ball helped her get into a state, and there's no question about that. But I feel like what she describes, and it's interesting when she talks about time, because she says, the things that are further out are harder to see, obviously. So when she's looking out at 2020, it's a little shadier than it was just to predict something 10 years in the future. But I think her process is interesting. She describes it a couple of different ways, because she says that some things are prophecies and some things are visions. So that's interesting to me because she's still trying to do it in the tradition of the biblical prophet, which probably says a lot for her trying to match her abilities up with the incredible kind of religious demands of her upbringing. So this is from People magazine. I'll just give the setup here. 1988 in May. This is when this big scandal breaks that Reagan uses astrologers and psychics. The year was 1980. The mood of the nation restless. The hostages languished in Iran. American athletes were sitting out the Olympics. In the White House, a dithering peanut farmer president looked to be wreaking havoc on the economy. That's Carter, of course. At least that's how it appeared to one conservative society lioness out west, whose husband had spent more time in politics but was now between jobs. This is Nancy Reagan. She felt she had a better man for the office. Just to be certain, however, she called up a friend, a well-born San Francisco Republican, for whom she had been taking counsel for several years. The woman, one Joan Quigley, quickly did an astrological chart on Jimmy Carter and got back to Reagan with good news about her husband's presidential bid. I was certain Ronald Reagan wouldn't have any trouble with him, says Quigley, who volunteered her services to the campaign and later provided them on a regular basis to the Reagan White House. Now, Quigley is a Vassar educated astrologer with country club manners and, as befits a lady, terribly discreet. By the end of the first term, her fellow astrologers had begun to notice the impeccable celestial timing of many Reagan moves, like the bombing of Libya and his announcement for a second term. I had astrologer friends calling me saying, Reagan must have had his chart done, Quigley recently confided during an interview in a suite at San Francisco's Fairmont Hotel. I just said, yes, he must have been consulting someone. So what happens is there's a guy as his chief of staff named Donald Regan, and Nancy Reagan really annoys him, and she thinks this guy's bad, like get rid of him, And so Reagan doesn't want to do it. So they become enemies, Nancy Reagan and Donald Regan, who's Reagan's chief of staff. So finally she convinces Reagan to fire him, and he comes out with a tell-all book, and he's like, Reagan uses all these astrologers and psychics, and it became quite a flap. Now, virtually, this is from Reagan's book, Donald Regan, speaking about how the Reagans used psychics and astrologers. Quote, virtually every major move and decision the Reagans made during my time as White House chief of staff was cleared in advance with a woman in San Francisco who drew up horoscopes to make certain that the planets were in a favorable alignment for the enterprise. Mm-hmm. Quite remarkable, because when you think about the Reagan presidency, it is a very successful presidency. If astrology was the Reagans' little secret, however, it was not very well kept. I have known since before Reagan was elected that they went to astrologers, said former Washington Post-style reporter Sally Quinn. That's why I'm surprised at all the surprise and shock. So we have this whole back and forth. The reporters know what's going on, but Reagan has this penchant for going to psychics and going to astrologers. And he also is getting that kind of good advice that guides his career. But we can see his lifelong friendship with Jeane Dixon makes a little more sense now. Now, there's always been a story about Reagan that goes back to when he got sworn in as governor in 1966 as the governor of California, which is that he announced he was going to take the oath of office at 12:10 a.m. And every reporter was like, what are you talking about? You usually do that at noon or like in the morning. What's going on here? Why does this guy want to do it at 12:10 a.m.? And so they dug through it at the time, and he had an astrology flap then because his astrologer at the time had given him this advice. So what we have with Reagan is somebody who understood the power of these psychic factors, the astrological factors, and he was major on the extraterrestrial front. And, I recounted that story that Steven Spielberg tells about screening E.T. at the White House and Reagan standing up and saying, not as a joke, but legitimately, that everyone here knows that this film that we've just seen is actually a reality. And so when we look at it from that angle, we can see that, again, Jeane Dixon and her relationship with Nixon and then now with Reagan, they're getting that pipeline into that psychic information that they need. Yes, what do you got, Ms. Olivia?
Tessa1111 wanted to know, was Jeane friends with Jackie Gleason? Is there any connection there?
Well, that's interesting. Nixon. They are,
they run around the same
they're
circles.
In the same circles. It's not like there are big stories about the two of them, but I definitely think that's a good tie over, because as we know, the major story about Nixon is that related to aliens is that he showed Gleason those dead aliens. And that's what came from a very good source, which was Gleason's ex-wife, who recounted the whole story. And everything that she said matched up because Nixon and Gleason were both in Florida at the time. So I've always believed that story, actually. But I do feel that when we look at this, by the way, that's in the People magazine article. It goes on, but there's some very important information in there in that sense about just how much they would work with this. And what I want to suggest is that in those political circles, they understand things like remote viewing. They understand psychic ability. They understand, astrological readings, because the mystery schools have had their influences through the political process. And as you have kind of both sides of the mystery schools, like there's the secret society aspect, which is more like a black magic thing. And then the mystery schools that are trying to move the culture forward, and trying to, get things going with the culture, like the space program, and give them an ideal. We have this balance between these groups. And so these people understand those skills very well, but they need to be belittled in public, because then everyone will have that ability. And then what are you going to do? Then you're really going to be in problems. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're in X Series 80, and this is all on Jeane Dixon and the psychic in the White House, from Reagan, Nixon, Roosevelt. Of course, her remarkable, just off the charts accuracy in terms of predicting the deaths of JFK, RFK, and some major international events. More importantly, you don't really get to hang around in these circles of coming in and giving advice for presidents unless you're really good. And I do think it's fair for Nixon's, in this case, Dixon's critics, to point out her, the misses where she went on the record and just struck out completely.
I've got a theory about that. I mean, Paul McCartney hasn't written a good song in 40 years or whatever. I just think that sometimes
that you have a prime.
You have a prime, and then your abilities fade, and we allow for that with athletes and with musicians and whatnot. But psychics know, they're supposed to be 100% or they're frauds, right?
Yes, and I'm going to tap into this on the Trump front too, in terms of who he may be using and what he may be, because I found a major Trump-Nixon tie-over in relation to that aspect. We still are going to have time to get into that. We're doing okay on time, but I can see that there are aspects of this that are going to have to split into 2 episodes. Just the nature of the beast. It's great to have everyone here. It's a fantastic night, as we know they announced Brexit. And that's going to be a major liberation over there. Just unbelievable stuff that they were pulling with the EU. So I'm glad that they got that done. I do notice that they announced this February 5th vote for Trump and his sort of ridiculous now, I have to say beyond ridiculous, impeachment. I can't even call it impeachment. It's just a political maneuver. And it has just no energy. Do you feel that? When you feel the divisiveness of that, it's interesting. Professor Peter Dale Scott came out and he was talking about it. And remember, Professor Scott is, he's a liberal Berkeley professor from UC Berkeley, so he shouldn't have any love for Trump. And he's the one who coined the term the deep state, by the way, which has been bastardized a lot. But, and he's been featured on this program many times, especially in relation to continuity of government programs. But Professor Scott says, we really just have to step away from the divisiveness in Washington, let them kind of collapse in their own house of cards, and move towards things collectively that, we feel we can get done with society. And it really makes a lot of sense because, whenever I see those headlines and the things coming up in Drudge or anywhere else or in the Twitter feed about impeachment, it's just become a weird sideshow. It has not moved anything, in any way for the culture. It hasn't done anything for the American people. It's been a waste of money. You've had real freak show people like Adam Schiff up there, and, $1 million Pelosi and everything that she's doing. And she's been in that office too long, obviously to pull these things. And then, whatever someone can think of Trump, this idea that some CIA agent can dime on him in a conversation that he had with the Ukraine about the bad deeds of Biden over there. I mean, these guys, if you went through the records of Obama, you're going to find the similar calls. You'd have to go back and impeach them all retroactively. It's ridiculous. So they didn't have the real goods on Trump, and they went for it anyway, which I think is very telling. I do want to say this in terms of inserting a little bit of commentary. The this incredible emphasis around sort of pumping up Netanyahu's government. Netanyahu is under indictment and really looks like he should go to jail. The fact that we're getting involved in that and making him look good, and some of the real missteps in 2020 for Trump have been this Iran policy, which has been incredibly harsh and almost got us into World War III right out of the gate. If you want Armageddon, you would have had it right there. With a war with Iran is the worst idea, and would be the greatest foreign policy blunder in history, no question. And a lot of this is playing out, and this whole plan for the Middle East, it was like, here's the plan. The settlers can take all the land and the Palestinians have to put up with it. It was not a good plan. Who did that? Brilliant Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Pompeo is the worst. He was the CIA director, and he was the one who was quoted saying, "We lied, we cheated, we stole." We just have to get Trump to get him to get rid of Pompeo. He's one of the worst disgraces I think we've had out there. And that neocon hawkish foreign policy was a hallmark of the Bush administration. It has no place in the Trump administration. And if he goes in that direction, he's going to lose the things that he gained by avoiding that in the first place. So this thing with Bolton is interesting because, Bolton's book and how they're trying to use the stuff against Trump. Trump took Bolton into the administration, and Bolton was an absolute hawk who wanted to bomb North Korea and bomb Iran. Everything, all of his solutions were totally hawkish. So in a way, it was like a weird karmic twist to have his book coming back and messing up the situation. But in any case, I think it's important to point out in relation to President Trump that Trump needs to move to kind of a center path on this and not get into, he needs to stick to what got him elected, which is saying we'll stay out of foreign wars, we'll support the borders, and we won't feed that machine. But instead, he signed the $740 billion NDAA. He's made the Space Force about war-fighting domain in space. So there are problems there, major problems. And I think to avoid some of these World War III scenarios and things like that, you have to get rid of the hawks. And so you can't have people like Pompeo in those high-level positions. So I think that's a crucial piece as we get along here. Yes, Ms.
Mount
Olivia.
Cleverest wants to know, DJ, who would make a good Secretary of State right now? Who would you appoint?
I think you could use a guy like Rand Paul, actually. I would use Rand Paul because he understands keeping out of international entanglements because his dad is Ron Paul. I think in a lot of the government offices, you need libertarian thinking in some ways. The libertarians, they understand their fundamental principles. And these are the fundamental principles, remember, of Washington and Jefferson, which is to stay out of foreign entanglements. We're not supposed to be involved on that level. We're supposed to be someone that nations can turn to. But we're not supposed to go around and flank them with military bases so they're freaked out. And we know the Democrats' solution, they could have really showed themselves as a big contrast to the Republicans. But instead, they got warlike, and they wanted to go to war with Russia, and then they came up with all the Russia hoax stuff. So we really need a third alternative. I want to suggest this. What is that?
Alison Goodwin says, dark journalist press secretary.
Well,
you'd be great.
I'll tell you, my idea about this is pretty interesting. This is what I think should happen. I'm just going to throw this in since we're on the subject.
Mm-hmm.
We need a 2% candidate. That is a candidate who can go out there and successfully get 2%, because he is going, or she is going to be the dividing factor between the Trump win or the Democrats win, because that's going to be a close election. Even though the Democrats have been fielding pretty bad candidates, there's enough resistance to Trump that it's going to be tight. That 2 or 3% candidate is going to be able to demand concessions from either side by saying, I'll swing my votes to you. But especially in the case of Trump, Trump will have to go back to his main principles if he wants to keep the presidency, and that 2 or 3% could be vital, especially since he lost the popular vote when he got in 2016. That person could say, one, stay out of war with Iran, two, get out of that ridiculous plan that you put down with Bibi Netanyahu and stop dealing with Netanyahu, look for other factors in the Israeli government to work with. And, and three, go through a series of things from 5G, things that represent the alternative media, from 5G to, the pushback around the vaccine issue. Where are all these issues? The Trump administration hasn't done anything. This incredible thing came out, which was this guy's scorecard who was originally pro-Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And is he Frogcaster?
Yeah, something like that.
It was Catherine Fitz.
Frog.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
right. PH Frog. I will put that link up on Twitter. Catherine Fitz had retweeted it. But this guy went through it. He did a good job. And he went through the various issues. And really, that's why the alternative media is so behind Trump in 2016. One, because they didn't want a nuclear war with Russia that Clinton was going to get us into. And I think that Trump, when he came in, had, a big push from the alternative media, probably along the lines of like 90%. So I think what we're looking at, and it is important since we're talking about presidents, to really take a quick look at this, which is that 2 to 3% candidate, the third option, could bring these issues to the table, running as an independent or as a libertarian. And if they could do it, if they could really get, not just run for the hell of it, but really move to get at least a good 2 or 3% or more, then they could sway the election and they could say at the last minute, I'll send you, I'll support you, I'll give you my votes. I'll tell my people to vote for you if you get behind these issues and you really mean it. That could make a really big difference because, having the Democrats just be this kind of, doing anything in a psychotic fashion to get back into power and using the CIA to do it, and then having Trump getting neocon stuff in his ear, it looks like we need a third alternative to push the picture back. That's my recommendation. I'm not saying a third party can win. It's probably too late. But they can sign up in enough states and they can have that presence, especially if it's an established party. Even, the Green Party has the ability to do this also. But I think this could be a crucial factor. So that's something that we're definitely going to explore as the year goes along. You're watching the Dark Journalist program. We are in episode X Series 80, and we're looking at Jeane Dixon, psychic in the White House, a remarkable figure with an interesting legacy and this amazing prediction for Armageddon 2020. But this is more of that Armageddon syndrome. Is it more specific to, kind of a World War III scenario or a nuclear conflagration or a worldwide global cataclysm? Or are we talking more about coming face to face with the shadow in that sense and moving on? Because, of course, her prediction also sees us doing a lot better after this year. So it's kind of fascinating when we get deep into it. So before I move into the next segment, Miss Olivia.
Najat Madri had a question about what did Dixon really mean by Armageddon? End of times or a spiritual Armageddon?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's funny because I was just sussing that out. What does she mean? Mm-hmm. I think we both have the question. Because I think on one hand, she understood on the biblical side very, very well what she was talking about. She had studied those prophecies, as you can see with her easy access when she's discussing the prophecies of Daniel or when she's going into Elijah and things like that. Very familiar with the Bible. But also she is aware enough to say, well, the culture is going to move forward. All these things are going to happen. We're going to have space travel like you've never seen it. So she's projecting these two futures when she's talking about it. And it's kind of interesting to me as well, because you would think Armageddon was total, but apparently not so. And is an aspect of Armageddon mental in terms of projection? And, so is it, again, it's facing ourselves in the mirror in the grand scheme of things. Over and over again, we look at all these different solutions in society and you say, well, there are these billionaires over here and they keep getting richer. And there are these aspects in society, and they talk like they're concerned about things, but the system's not changing, and there are still people who are underprivileged. And so, what does it take? One of the things in a recent lecture by Professor Scott, who I was very happy to hear was still lecturing at 91, and we will get back on this program, was he said, it's very important that we have something which moves us back into being a productive society. And he didn't know what that something was going to be, but he felt like whether it was a major issue, like an earth changes issue, or we know the way we talk about environment and climate change, we know that's been manipulated so much. But if there were some major thing that happened, in relationship to the sun or the environment, whatever it was, that would turn society around. And I happen to think that that's true, actually, as it turns out. But yeah, great question.
And I was speaking, I'll just say that to the audience, to a kind of a wise woman today. And she brought up basically that this is an initiation for all of us.
Yes.
And what we choose matters, where we stand. She was talking about her medicine wheel, being in the heart of your medicine wheel. And there are no guarantees. And we are facing, each one of us, our own fears here. But that's a sacred initiation. And
yes,
to take it on fully.
I think it's important. I'll tell you, whether they're guests on this show or people I talk to behind the scenes or authors or people that you would know. And when I've spoken to them, it's interesting to me how many of them say, there's no time left. We need to change things now. For me, that's a real bellwether. It's a real echo of what's coming, which is people realize there's some kind of a shift. And I don't want to suggest it as a dramatic, I think it is always in little things that we make the biggest difference. And I feel like it's that force of realization which changes the paradigm. And look at Brexit, for example. This is an aspect. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's
yes.
showing.
And let's take a minute and just congratulate everybody in Britain. It's so exciting.
Yeah, right.
It's a huge achievement. We're so happy for you. Cheers.
Absolutely. So we have the ability to do that here. The 2016 election had that type of a feel to it. It had that major change. The machine didn't win. And so the 2020 election should have we need to take this and move it in the right direction. And I think it is crucial. And I think the stakes are very high. And, as we've seen with the virus and everything else, there are all these factors when you come into 2020 immediately that suggest you're going to have to step up your game. So let's look at some people who took the opportunity to do that. Now, one of the things I want to do actually is go through some of the links here to Dixon's family and the Mason-Dixon line and the archaeology, astronomy, masonry aspects that have to do with this to kind of complete the picture on that. And then in the second part of this program now, we're going to be taking your questions, and Miss Olivia will be assembling those. So you can ask them all in caps. That's going to help her keep track of them. And oh my God, I don't even know how she does it, but she has a kind of a supernatural ability to posit those. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. The news tonight was that Zero Hedge got thrown off Twitter. Do you
permanently
see? Isn't that interesting? Well, do you see how that can happen? You say something they don't like and you're out. So we need that pipeline with each other. And so go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. The newsletter is free, and basically about once a week, it'll give you an update on the shows we have coming up for you, and also the incredible events that are being planned out, as well as some remarkable guests coming up for February and March. And some of these shows you're going to want to be a member for, because there's going to be some special benefits for that. And I've made it very affordable, and I've even kept it for last year's price. We're going to keep that as long as we can, at least through parts of February. So go to the site, get behind the program and behind the work that we're doing here. We can only do this work with you guys behind us, so it makes a big difference. And like I said, I've always said, even if I had to broadcast off an iPhone, I would I would do it for sure. And Olivia knows that I'm serious when I say it. So, but yeah, thank you for everyone who is behind the show, and to all our subscribers and our supporters. All right, Jeane Dixon. Now, we've gone through some things with Jeane, and I think that we've gotten a picture of the kind of the real specter of the woman's influence. It's quite remarkable, and she lived a remarkable life, and she wanted the best for society. There's no question about it. There are people who can always look at psychics and failed predictions and things like that. But I think when you just see the kind of cumulative picture of everything that she contributed and the people that she influenced and where she was coming from, along with her remarkable predictions that did come true, then I think we get a fuller picture. And I think it's very important not to believe the hype around on the negative. This is the Stargazer's Stone, erected in 1764 by Mason-Dixon and locating the Pennsylvania-Maryland boundary line, being 15 miles north thereof and 31 miles due west of Philadelphia. That is the Stargazer's Stone. This is very important to understand about the Mason-Dixon line, which is that these were astronomers, master astronomers from England, both Mason and Dixon, and we get a better idea when we put them in that context. The traditional thing is that, well, over the boundaries there were going to be wars and it needed to be done this way. I'm sure that's true, but they were taking advantage of the opportunity to survey those lines to observe incredible astronomical transits. And that's something that we're going to find out about both of them. For example, Mason, I'm just going to run through a little bit of his background. Charles Mason of the Mason-Dixon line fame, the partner of Dixon, who is the ancestor of Jeane Dixon's husband. Okay, English astronomer who made significant contributions to 18th century science, particularly through his involvement with the survey of the Mason-Dixon line, which came to mark the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania. And again, remembering that Moon Township there is involved in this, being in Pennsylvania, and I'm going to point that out. While employed at the Greenwich Observatory, the Royal Greenwich Observatory near London, Mason became familiar with Professor Tobias Meyer's Table of the Moon. The lunar tables were designed to solve the problem of determining longitude at sea. I found this moon tie-in interesting with Moon Township, especially since it's through their survey that we get this. There are very many observatories that they had throughout this area as well. And we're going to, when we look at Moon a little bit deeper, we're going to find some of that. From November 1763, remember Kennedy was celebrating the centennial, 200 years, to 1768, Mason and Jeremiah Dixon established the boundary line between the American provinces of Pennsylvania and Maryland. This is pre-revolution. So Mason and Dixon failed to measure the entire length of the south boundary of Pennsylvania as determined by its charter. So what happens is where that moon section is, that becomes done by someone else named Andrew Ellicott. I just want to point him out briefly because this is the person who set up the District of Columbia. And we're starting to get an idea that the stones that delineate the Mason-Dixon line, these are called boundary stones. But what they are is astronomical standing stones, the same way that we have those throughout Salisbury in the UK and Karnak in France and everywhere else. That's kind of the trick to this, which is these are Egyptologists and Dixon, and with Ellicott, astronomers, with Mason, astronomers, archaeologists, Egyptologists. Keep that in mind as we go, because it makes that whole setup of DC make a lot more sense. And then whenever we get into the Masonic laying out of these things and how they know the original rules of the Egyptian mystery schools in terms of building principles, then these things start to make a lot of sense to us. And we can bring the topic back around because it is Dixon who is related to these people through history. So a quick thing about Ellicott, which is I want to show his map. Let's see if I can find it in time. Miss Olivia, in the meantime,
Dennis O'Neill wants to know, when are DJ and Olivia going to publish the official and real esoteric history of the U.S.?
Well, take a look at that. That is a map of the boundary stones of Washington, D.C. It's a pretty interesting pattern. You have to admit, it doesn't look random by any stretch of the imagination. It's very interesting diamond formation, and this is what our friend Ellicott laid out. Interestingly enough, if you look closely on some of those, they have X's on them. And the reason that they do is because those stones are gone. Somehow they didn't survive.
Wait, what do you mean?
They're just
Somebody
not there.
moved them, clearly. They didn't just walk away.
It's a good point, especially since they're in these like little cages and very hard to get at. I want to take a look at this and put this on the record. This is what's known as the Ellicott line here. And what we have is Moon is right about here. So it's right on that line. The Mason-Dixon line is right underneath it. And as we can see, DC right underneath that. Okay, so if we're all on the same page there, this is Ellicott's original design of Washington, D.C., in combination with some others. And there's lots of steganography there, but that's not why I'm pointing it out. I just want to give us that thrust that Ellicott is another one of these people who's very important. And he's got that other piece. So we have the Mason-Dixon line on one side, and we have the Ellicott line on the other. And right in the middle of that is Moon. And that gives us back to Moon and why Moon is so important, that all these townships, you know, basically who never get presidents, but here Moon gets them all the time, but only really since this period when Ford pardoned Nixon. Now, you know, we've spoken and we can speculate about time capsules and things like that. There was this interesting history of a time capsule in relation to the elementary school, which also serves as a bomb shelter. And that's the one that Ford spoke at. So I think it's undeniable when we look at that imagery of the next day after Nixon is pardoned, Ford shows up in this unusual little elementary school. And what's he doing there? And why is Moon Township, you know, in the middle of this? And why does every president, including Trump, since Ford, visit there? Why is it such a big deal? It doesn't seem to hold a really large voting bloc. There's only 22,000 people there. It's nice. It's nice there for sure. But usually, you know, politics are motivated in particular directions. The imagery for Ford in particular bothers me because whenever I see this on the political side, it means something else. And for Ford to show up at Moon Township after pardoning Nixon is a message to somebody. Now, interestingly enough, it was an unplanned stop. So they had to set out the Secret Service to check out the grounds, make sure everything was okay. There's some reason that's driving Ford to do all this. And we have to kind of get on board with why they might be doing this. And I do want to say again that that 76 bicentennial time capsule is something that they had there originally. And it was, you know, the school was eventually destroyed, as I had put forward in the article. So when we look at Moon, then we also have the stories about the township. And one of the interesting stories I found was actually on patch.com. And Patch was very interesting. They had a story there about Moon and how it got to be what it is. And Moon, there's the story that, hey, you know, the river kind of looks like a moon crest. And that's how they got the name. But there was the person who was like the elder in the town said that's not how they got the name at all. and that it's related to something else. And he didn't say what that something else was, but he said the story that they've stuck the town with doesn't hold up. And then when we look at that in relation to the name Moon and how it is explore the universe is their motto, I think that, there's a reason why there's an international airport so close by, why these presidents go there. And in my opinion, what I'm seeing by looking at this is that it relates somehow to the work on the Mason-Dixon line and on the Endicott line, that somehow there's something in that. It's like a power spot for some reason. Now, oddly enough, there's two interesting tie-overs that I see in Jeane Dixon's work to this. One, being associated with the Mason-Dixon line through her family, she now can give advice to people who are, like Ford taking over for Nixon, and say, this is where you should put that, that whole thing about the time capsule. That is pure speculation, but I have to say it does ring a bell. The other thing I want to mention is Robert Merritt's story about Nixon mentioning 2020. A lot of people said, why would Nixon even mention 2020 to Merritt? It's just kind of a random thing to do. And I thought that also. But the more I think about Dixon and her influence on Nixon and her prediction for 2020 and 71, the next year, Merritt is there getting this sort of overview of the future from Nixon, where he makes this cryptic remark about 2020. He's probably getting the 2020 date from Jeane Dixon. So these things tend to serve to validate even more Merritt's story about what he's saying there. So now I'm going to jump in with more information about Moon, but I think we better go to questions for time. So Miss Olivia, it's up to you.
Kontiki Man wanted to know, how far in the future did Dixon's visions go?
Well, the dates that she saw went from 2020 to 2037. That's what she says in Call to Glory. And I haven't seen anything further out past that. So I would tend to think that that's really where she's at with it. Yes.
Did she prophesize her own death?
She did. That's something which she was known, just like with the Oprah situation, she was known to come in and really give somebody a powerful statement about their lives. And as it turned out, in her case, she knew that her death was approaching, and she had predicted it just a couple of days before she died. And what's interesting is all the papers reported 79-year-old Jeane Dixon dies, but in fact, she was 93. So there's that 14-year difference from the 1918 that everyone assumed Dixon had been born in the 1904, which is where she actually was born. And it's kind of a very different life when you look at it that way. And I think on the face of it, people assume that it is related, and it's kind of obscure, this thing about her first marriage before she married Dixon. However, there could be something even stranger in relation to this, because there are people in the mystery school traditions like Gurdjieff who you can never actually pin down their birth date. So, for example, Ouspensky believed that Gurdjieff was born in 1877, but a number of people who were his students felt that he was born in 1863, a 14-year gap. Now, it's been said that that happens in the mystery schools, so they can't do your chart. So that, if somebody's in opposition to you and you are working on this kind of mystery school front, that someone can't figure out your trajectory. So it's kind of interesting when you look at it that way. But I can't say that there's any flat out proof that, that aspect is active in the Jeane Dixon story. But what's very clear is that there's 3 different versions of her birth date, for sure. Yes, Ms.
Okay, so I'm trying to find it. Cooper Fighter wanted to know any papal connections to Jeane Dixon.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and she does. I mean, what's interesting, though, is she is very tied in with that religious establishment. However, what's interesting is that the Southern religious tradition, that those people like Strom Thurmond, still lock in with her almost in a tighter way. The conservative religious leaders are very tight with her. And I found an interesting event where she introduced Reverend Moon. Remember Reverend Moon, who created the Moonies and all that. So very, very conservative stuff on that. And one thing I would say is this aspect about Nixon's pyramid is interesting because it shows with her influence on him, and I'm going to show this the setup for Nixon's pyramid, but what it is essentially, it looks very much like Stonehenge, but with pyramids. It's that kind of a layout. It looks like the structure at Giza. So the question becomes, what were these people really up to? What kind of an influence were they getting? And we know in the case of Jeane Dixon, she had this incredible February 5th, 1962 vision about Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Is that what we're looking at? And so it could very well be, as it were. But I know that there's probably something else there in relation to her religious background. But yes, Miss Olivia.
Flowing through. Did Casey ever remark about Jeane Dixon?
I think they're kind of in different eras, and we don't have anything of her going to Casey for a reading, although he would have been the most popular psychic of that period in the 20s and 30s. So I'm sure she was aware of him, and I think that it's not too different the way that they did their psychic work, because we have to remember too that Casey was brought into the White House of Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson originally called Casey to the White House to get medical readings. And as it turned out, Casey would help him lay out the famous 14 points. So he kept him going, for this whole period of sort of laying out what his legacy would be. And so you can see the impact that Casey had there. But what's fascinating is there's someone named Harmon Brough who worked as kind of an intern for Casey. And he said that Henry Wallace, who was the VP for FDR, kept calling and trying to make reading appointments. And that the reading appointments that he made, by the time he was going to do them, actually Casey had passed away. But we see this very often. And, there's another thing of a story that Shirley MacLaine has about President Carter, which is when he left office. He invited her down to his ranch, and he said, "What is the alien thing all about?" And
then couldn't deal with it, right? And she gave him
right,
the truth.
exactly. It's a good point. So it is. I think that we are, looking at a variety of situations there, and then Nixon, Nixon on the disclosure side, we have a lot of information now on that front, but he's a Quaker. And his family line is very unusual. And the Hemingways intersect with that family line. So I think that we have to look at these people a little bit differently. Now, I want to mention something very strong in relation to Nixon and exteganography that also comes under this influence of Jeane Dixon on him and the pyramid, the whole Nixon pyramid idea. This is a logo for a very important center that Nixon set up, which is the Nike X Sentinel. Now, that is the statue of Nike, but, missing the heads and everything. And there's the X steganography buried right in the heart of it. Nixon had set up a program called Sentinel, which was going to be an anti-ballistic missile program. And that's a picture of Nixon with Anwar Sadat at the pyramids, the actual Great Pyramids. And this took place in 1974, shortly before he had to resign. And interestingly enough, Sadat would be assassinated some 6 years later. But this is Nixon's pyramid. This was set up in North Dakota, and it was an entire complex that was basically meant to be a great defender of America in the case of a nuclear attack. However, there's no reason for it to be shaped or designed like that. here's a larger picture of it. And when you look at it, you have to say to yourself, this really looks like the Giza Plateau. I mean, it certainly has those aspects. What do you think, Ms. Olivia?
Definitely.
When I look at it, it's very clear. The original setup for it, the blueprint, which I found, this is quite fascinating because it shows it was really being laid out the way that these ancient buildings were laid out. And it was part of something called the Safeguard Program. I'm going to read a little bit about it now, but the Safeguard Program was a U.S. Army anti-ballistic missile program designed to protect the U.S. Air Force's Minuteman ICBM silos from attack. And they started it actually originally. The idea was crafted in the 50s when Nixon was VP. And then eventually as president, he wound up finishing it. By 1960, it was clear that this first version of it was called Nike Zeus. It wasn't powerful enough. And it said it provided no protection against a sophisticated attack. A new design emerged, Nike X. Now, they used Nike X steganography to create this program, and it became a passable program. They invested in that period of time when Nixon was president $6 billion to complete this, which is massive in a period like that, especially when they were being accused of, being big spenders and everything else. So this was a very unusual thing to do. Richard Nixon announced that Sentinel would be canceled and that they would instead go for this Nike X program. So he's the one who moved this forward. And there's kind of a few different facts about the North Dakota program. One is that when it became operational, they decided quickly to shut it down because they built it during the Nixon period, but it became operational when he was leaving office. And immediately they shut this thing down. So after spending all this money, it's left there as this hollow reminder of something, this incredible design and its incredible purpose. But again, this looks like something that Nixon was influenced to do by someone like Jeane Dixon to create this kind of Giza, reinvent Egypt here in America as a defense program. And the Nike X, using the X steganography, they were indicating clearly that they were using advanced technology around this. So I think that they felt this thing's too out in the open. Too many people know about it. Now, here's a weird thing that a lot of people don't know about it, which is there was a huge UFO wave in that period. And in 75, when they shut it down after Nixon left office, there's a gigantic UFO wave in North Dakota. And so when we look at that, I think we're getting the hint that something very unusual for what it was originally built for was changed, or there's something kind of remarkable just in the layout of it. But I think there's a lot of information if we go deeper on it. I'm just going to read something about Nike X because this is the crucial kind of piece. Now, the Kennedy administration turned to the newly created ARPA to suggest solutions. And so they went through and made all these changes to it, which was McNamara was his defense secretary who handled this. Now, this is interesting because the original program was set up under Nixon, and then Kennedy makes changes to Nike X through McNamara. McNamara is the person he sent out as defense secretary to really make sure his plans were implemented. And he was the one who had to go forward to NASA to really rope them in from the secret space program they were developing, because NASA had become the plaything of the paperclip scientists that we had brought over, like von Braun, and they really had their own agenda at that point. And so Nike X became something that was the answer to all these programs. And eventually Nike X becomes the anti-ballistic missile program that they have safeguarding out of North Dakota. The fact that this thing was never used, that they wasted this $6 billion on it, and it went through a series of different deployment plans, and that it has this kind of very bizarre appearance and then a wave of UFO sightings around it. I think that we're looking at something which clearly was influenced, at least in part, by Dixon giving, in Nixon's ear, telling him you need to develop this kind of sacred way of developing an umbrella, a shield, for the United States. And here she is drawing in this ancient Egyptian work, just as she did in her other work, in her predictions. So I think we're getting a handle there on what was Nixon's pyramid all about. What is Nike X? That's somehow meant to be part of this program he's bringing forward for the bicentennial. That uses alternative energy. It's going to be up and ready. And they spent all this money on it. They're going to be able to reveal it. And he's going to be able to run for a third term, which was not allowed at that time, by converting the United States to a different energy model. That's the kind of summation of what Nixon was doing. And Jeane Dixon was right there helping him all the way through, giving him this incredible counsel as she went along. Whether that counsel was just astrological or psychic, she's injecting this esoteric factor. And somehow Nixon knows to trust her. So it gives us this incredible kind of background on it. Okay, Miss Olivia.
PV says it could be a shield for missiles from Mars or aliens.
It has to be at least considered. And I have to say that when we look at Nixon, he's infinitely practical. But I will say that there's a section that I was listening to in looking back and reviewing tapes that I have, digital recordings of Robert Merritt. And in conversation, he did say on a couple of occasions that Nixon told him that the off-world civilizations and the UFO file didn't pose any threat to the United States or the world. So he was completely clear about that with Merritt. So it's always been my position that since we've had these waves since the 40s, and we know that they go all the way back to biblical times and beyond, that those groups of visitors and that technology wave, whatever you want to attribute it to, obviously they haven't shown any hostile action, and they've allowed us to build up to a certain point where maybe our technology could even be hazardous for them. So this whole idea that there's a UFO threat out there, I've never bought that. Yes.
Mikkel Grum Bovin. Did Nixon meet Valiant Thor, or Dixon for that matter? What do you think?
Well,
Nixon, of course, has a long history
That was a
with
great
the
shot.
UFO file.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a preacher, Frank Stranges, who put out this book saying that that's where this whole Stranger at the Pentagon program comes from. And he said that he met Valiant Thor, who was a visitor from another place, who was a very well-dressed person, and that this guy was meeting with Nixon and Eisenhower, and that he was discussing basically, we're here to visit you, and we don't want you to blow yourself up, that kind of thing. So I think it's kind of fascinating story that's hanging out there about Valiant Thor, because after all, Frank Stranges was a minister. So you don't expect, he was a minister at the Pentagon. You don't expect him to lie about things like that, but you never know, I guess. But no, there's no real proof of it, but there is his testimony, which there's a book actually where he recounts meeting Valiant Thor. And Valiant Thor is one of those kind of interesting urban legends, because we'll never be able to figure out what's going on there, but it's a damn good story. Yes.
Najat Madri, could the use of the X be the symbol for the alien influence on humanity, since visitors have been here since the beginning of time? It's as good a theory as any that we've come up with. I think it's a great theory.
Well, I can tell you this, which is that the X steganography was held by the mystery schools as far back as Atlantis. So, it gets brought forward in the Christian tradition, and it survives in the Hermetic tradition, Pythagoras, and we see them kind of animating it in 20th century government programs for secrecy purposes. So it's there throughout as a factor. And since the X technology, whatever aspect you want to attribute it to, but whatever it was that they were carrying, and it is advanced civilization in ancient times where this originally came from, it resides inside the UFO file now. That's why there's so much secrecy around that. That's why you have these diversionary programs. First they cover it up for 70 years, and then they come out and say, hey, we found it. And by the way, they're a threat. And, you guys give us another $1 trillion, we'll take care of them. And then, by the way, we need that $1 trillion every year. And then you put up guys like Elizondo and, Bobo DeLong. That's what you're going to get. So, there's a lot of little programs out there like that. That one in particular is like a market tester of how they can do it. But the idea of the amount of people that they got involved with it, like, for example, the New York Times and Politico, and how they all were relying on this fake story from the Pentagon spokesman, Dana White, who had been fired for bribery. It shows you that they definitely want this story to be marginalized and kept where they can manage it. And remember, we have to keep in mind when it comes to the CIA presence in the UFO file, that the CIA just in 2015 came out and said, remember all those reports of UFOs in the 50s, 60s, and 70s? That was us. So they were dismissing that whole history. And now they want to come out with this phony threat program? I don't think so. So whatever it is around the UFO file, disclosure and questions along that line can only be handled by groups that are not intelligence related, because the CIA is an extra constitutional force, and from dragging us into war with Iraq with the phony WMD report to covering up the assassination of President Kennedy, all these things, you don't go to them for the truth on the UFO matter. No way.
I've got a bunch of great comments on Moon. Okay, so.
Okay. Before you get to them, I have a Moon thing here.
Okay.
And this dovetails nicely because I want them all. Check this out. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is episode X series, episode 80. And we're dealing with Jeane Dixon, psychic in the White House, Armageddon syndrome 2020, going deep here on the whole kind of specter of 2020 as it's emerged in the first month here. We're finally through that first month, but whoa, already we can tell. And I want to remind everyone, with Zero Hedge being thrown off social media, Twitter, and Zero Hedge is huge now, if they can just grab them and get rid of them, then we need a different way to communicate. So make sure you're on that newsletter. So go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. It's free, but it'll keep you abreast of everything that we have going on. And certainly you have the ability, when you go there, to subscribe to the site and get behind the work that we're doing here. You're going to want to be a part of that as we roll out these incredible guests and events for you in 2020. And some of the stuff I can easily say now is going to be absolutely breathtaking because I already know some of it's coming. So definitely take the opportunity, and thank you for your support. Okay, Moon Township, quick things. This is the guy who is kind of in charge of the township and holding the history of things that happen. Earl Edwards. He says, the story of Moon, it's a lousy story. Goes like this. Settlers arriving in what is now the western portion of Allegheny County named the region Moon, after the crescent-shaped curvature of the Ohio River. And for the past few centuries, the peculiar name Moon Township has stuck. Well, that's the official history, said Edwards, president of the Old Moon Township Historical Society. It's a lousy story, and that's really the only story we've got, he said. If you look at the map, it doesn't look much like a moon. I know there's really something else behind it, but we just can't say. Moon Township celebrates its 225th anniversary this year, marking the 1788 founding of the community. Pennsylvania legislators voted that year to establish both Allegheny County and several townships within its vast borders. I'm going to make a prediction here, which is unusual for me, but since we're talking about Jeane Dixon, why not? I think if somebody really looks into this story, you're going to find out that Moon Township was named after the work of Mason and Dixon, because they were studying the Venus transits and the moon transits, and they were using that area to study the moon transits. That's where it came from. That's why the story of the curve of the moon doesn't jive. Both Moon Township and Allegheny County were much bigger then than they are now, Edwards said. Moon would have extended all the way from Chartiers Creek to what is now West Virginia. That was the old Moon Township. It was quite a vast place. In the late 1700s, modest homesteads and cabins punctuated the countryside, said Historic Society member Deborah Kennedy, who has studied historic estates in Moon. Just a couple of quick things here. So in that period, Moon was a dangerous place to live. And what happened was George Washington surveyed the area of Moon. That's pretty heavy. Now, this is also pretty wild because it turns out that Washington goes forward and he asks our friend Andrew Ellicott, who is the one who set up the Ellicott line there, so close to Moon, where Pittsburgh is and everywhere else. He asks him to spec out DC. So something very interesting is going on there with Moon and its history in relation to our history. And remember, that survey work is done before the revolution, but Moon becomes a community after the revolution. So there's a deeper secret in relation to this. And the tip-off is that when President Ford gives a full pardon to President Nixon for all of his crimes, that he gets his first photo opportunity in elementary school, which is also a bomb shelter, in Moon, from which he's followed every president, well, most of them. I don't know if Carter was in there, but everybody else showed up. And it's quite remarkable, I think, when we look at that to see there's something about Moon in relation to this. Okay. There's one last piece about Moon, which is that Pittsburgh International Airport gets put close by. That's why Moon becomes so famous. Now, they built the Pittsburgh International Airport in Moon. The former Robert Morris College in the 60s bought a mansion and gardens from the Oliver Kaufman family with plans to grow its campus in Moon Township. Life centered around Sharon Village in the 1890s. So then what's interesting is supposedly the steel industry in Pennsylvania starts to be centered in Moon, which is also quite remarkable. The airport was supposed to protect Pittsburgh's abundant steel industry from the Nazis. It also brought new developments to its host community through Moon's reputation as a farming town. So then they decide to make other areas, and they call them Moon Crest and all the rest of it once they move in and do this. And then Kennedy says, so many people don't know the origins of Moon. I think it's because Moon has traditionally been such a transient community with the airport. And it makes an interesting point. What I want to kind of summarize in relation to the Moon Township is the incredible background that Jeremiah Dixon and Mason have in relation to the Royal Astronomical Society in London. And they are sent as far away as Java to witness the Venus transits and these moon transits. And especially in the case of the Venus transit, that's 1761, it was particularly important for the record books. And what's fascinating is when I went into the history of his descendants, who, of course, become eventually Jeane Dixon's husband. But when I looked at his descendants, I found them in the late 19th century in Egypt, in the Queen's Chamber, finding relics, finding shafts, which they wouldn't re-find again until the 1990s. So that whole thing about John Dixon and his brother being there in Egypt and bringing Cleopatra's Needle over probably gets us into a totally different episode. But I'll tell you, that's powerful stuff considering where they came from. So the Dixon family has that whole history. And to me, it's very telling that Ford goes back, boom, and he lands in that spot, which was so important for them astronomically. That's where he shows up after he pardons Nixon. There's some deeper significance to that, especially when you look at the work between Dixon and Nixon. Yes.
Okay, so Judy Carr said the Moon-Eyed people lived in Pennsylvania. Cherokee story, I think. She also said a meteor hit that area of Pennsylvania a bit south in the 70s, UFO and Bigfoot flap.
Wow.
And Richard Babcock said NORAD crew to pick up Kecksburg craft, take to moon for storage. Crew returns to Oakdale, Pennsylvania, NORAD post. President's interest, craft came down in 1965.
Wow. That's a great question. How close is Kecksburg to Moon? That would be really interesting. But they have those military facilities in Moon, so that does make sense. They would take it there. I would love someone who's a resident from that area to tell us any of the history from that. But those are great points. Here's the thing. There's something in relation to it, and it's been off the radar for a long time. But when I looked into the history of these boundary stones, and these are going to form the kind of foundation of another X-Series episode, the boundary stones themselves serve a dual purpose. Because on one hand, they're telling you this is where the boundary for this state is and all the rest of it. But I don't actually buy some aspects of that. I think a lot of them are astrological markers. And that's why I think you have, we've had amazing studies, and people do books and series and documentaries on the Masonic layout of DC. We understand that history. We don't know what it's about, but we know that this is what they did. But the boundary stones, in my opinion, relate to this deeper history because they're even pre-revolution. And so the fact that they have this kind of link in there with James Dixon and his family going back, and that it is really the Dixons bringing over these Egyptian obelisks to London, to New York, to DC. And that's bringing the school back together, because that mystery tradition of the Masons originally comes back to the ancient mystery schools of Egypt. So whatever it was that they were up to there, it's quite fascinating. And what you're going to find when you look at Dixon's work is, John Dixon that is, that the work that he did in relation to Cleopatra's Needle, that when they're shipping Cleopatra's Needle, it actually disappears and then it resurfaces. And then what's very odd is the artifacts that he brings back from the Great Pyramid and the Queen's Chamber, they disappear. In that case, they disappear for 100 years and then resurface. By the way, that is...
Don't gloss over that. That's a pretty big deal.
That is the Cleopatra's Needle ship that John Dixon built. And remember, John Dixon now being in the direct ancestral line of James L. Dixon, Jeane Dixon's husband. This, I think, gets us pretty advanced, because he needs to ship this over, and he's building this somewhere in the 1870s. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. He was building bridges there in Cairo as well. But one quick note I want to make about him is that when we look at the artifacts, just want to get this in at the end here. These were the artifacts that the Dixons found in the Queen's Chamber. Well, that's them all together. You have a granite ball over here. Then you have a piece of the pyramid in a case. And then you have these hooks, which are used for something called the opening of the mouth ceremony, where they have the pharaoh going into the afterlife. The priest will use this, and somehow it assists him in going into his journey into the afterlife. This is a close-up of these items rediscovered years later. There's the granite ball, still in perfect condition, and there's the hook. But they found something else in here, which is missing now, which is, this was originally accounted for. And it is a cedar wand. Now, the cedar wand is unusual because it's accounted for until it arrives back in the UK, and then it disappears. What's interesting is the way it's described as cedar, they would be able to do carbon dating tests on it so that you would know the period when it was put in there, unlike the stone, which you can't do carbon dating on to get any accurate points. In fact, this wand would be the key to the date of the Great Pyramid. which may have been one of the reasons that it disappeared. There's been a long story about this. There was something that came up recently about this mummy returns, voice of 3,000-year-old Egyptian priest brought to life. That is a good story. And it's something where they 3D printed the voice box of a pharaoh from that period inside the mummy. And they got some interesting sounds. They didn't really get much out of it, but it is interesting that they're trying. One quick thing on this point also is there is an article on ancientorigins.com by a guy named Morgan Smith about the lost artifacts of the Great Pyramid, the mysterious case of the Dixon relics. This is a good overview because it borrows from the work of Robert Bauval, who really tracked this story down. Now, anyone who's familiar with Robert Bauval and the Orion Mystery, he's one of the kind of greats out there, along with Graham Hancock and John Anthony West, who's passed away, who really opened this story up. And so a couple of quick things here, and then we'll get to the rest of your questions along the line. In 1872, after Dixon and his colleague, Dr. James Grant, chiseled their way into the sealed Queen's Chamber of the pyramid, now this is the Great Pyramid of Giza, they inserted a rod into the northern shaft. Like its southern counterpart, the northern shaft passes 7 feet into the wall before slanting upward. Those are those unusual. Have you ever seen the Great Pyramid when they show it and they do that little X-ray? You can see those kind of lanes going out. Dixon's probe managed to loosen 3 objects among rubble in the shaft: a bronze grappling hook, a granite ball, and a short rod described as cedar-like by Dixon. This is key. The objects were taken back to Britain, where the discovery incited a great deal of interest before they eventually disappeared from the record. For nearly a century, as it was later learned by researcher Robert Bauval, the relics remained in the possession of the Dixon family. And in 1972, Dixon's great-granddaughter offered the artifacts to the British Museum. Well, they once more disappeared, only to resurface again in 1993, 21 years later, through the arduous efforts of Bauval. The cedar rod, however, remains inexplicably missing. I think this is interesting. Whenever we get around the Dixons, we're dealing with Masonry, we're dealing with Egyptology, even though they take up things like, they become very big here in the railroads, even though they take up these traditional things. Astronomy, Egyptology, archaeology, Masonry, very unusual group with a lot of esoteric leanings, and everything that they do, including the Mason-Dixon line, shows up in this very unusual esoteric fashion. Yes.
Arc Logos, why is DJ so certain that Nixon's pyramid was an alternative energy station?
Well, we know that he was working on alternative energy from the stories that were coming out in the period, if you go back in the period. And I remember speaking with someone who was there in that time, and they had heard the stories too. This is in 1974, 1975. And the idea was that he was working on an alternative energy source so he could come out triumphantly and say, the Arab oil crisis didn't break us. Because we have to remember the 70s were an incredibly broke period. We understand the world from the 80s forward, and that's when I grew up, and that it's a different world. And there was incredible funny money in the 80s. There was money, coming from every direction. We were printing money, and we were loosening all the regulations and all the rest of it. Before that, we had inflation. We had, the 21% interest rates. It was just killing on people. And so people did not have money. And so this idea of the Arab oil crisis looked like it could cripple an entire nation. This is very important to understand why they were looking at real alternative energy in that period. It might have been one of the reasons why Nixon, they really felt they had to get rid of them. Now, those stories were that he was developing an alternative energy source, but it wasn't going on here. It was happening in Australia at Pine Gap, which is basically our Australian version of Area 51, but we still run the place. And there's an incredible incident, which I covered in the show that we did in the X series for Pine Gap, where Gough Whitlam, who's the prime minister, he was the one who they threw out of office. The Queen had the Governor General revoke the Constitution to get rid of him. So she only used that power. She never used that power in the entire lifetime of Australia. It was just used to get rid of Gough Whitlam. So this is an extraordinary thing, but just a year earlier, an extraordinary constitutional process had taken place to remove Nixon. So if we put those two together, it makes a lot more sense. I'll put it to you that way. So Nixon's pyramid, if you're going to spend $6 billion on something and then scrap it, it seems to me it was built for something else.
Breach 123. John Kennedy wrote an article about Moon, Pennsylvania, and moving old graves and bodies of baby bones with red hair. Look up, quote, the Friends of Moon Historical Society.
Fantastic. Fantastic. What a great
you.
find. Great find. If you have anything on that, send it to me at info@darkjournalist.com. But I'll definitely look it up from there.
So I guess the NORAD base is only 16 miles from the Moon, they were saying.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Moon, I have to tell you, I got the sense as I was studying aspects of Moon that there's going to be some kind of major aspects as we look into its history. And it feels to me that Moon has been something that's intentionally been left off the radar. It's something that you wouldn't understand how it would be connected to these things. The dead giveaway for me is that I was looking at all the incidents around Nixon's demise and Watergate. And one of those incidents is the fact that he gets pardoned for the whole thing. The fact that Moon plays a big piece in that, and that's the first public appearance after this incredible move by Ford, which dooms his re-election process and really sparks a lot of outrage. I mean, we might not realize it now. When you look back at those reports, there are protests everywhere he goes because nobody wanted Nixon pardoned because the media had been whipped up into a frenzy about his crimes, and nobody had ever seen a president do these things in public before. Now we're a little more used to it, But so we have to put ourselves in that mindset. So what really was going on back there? Have we tapped into the aspect, why is Nixon on the record now, without anybody's testimony, on the record supporting a UFO disclosure documentary in 1972? We know that he had this incredible background in it. Now let's put in the testimony of merit, saying, I have to put this time capsule away because I have these plans with this energy formula and with the knowledge of the UFO to inform the American people about it. Now I can't do it. And remember, in that conversation, he mentions running for a third term. That makes sense to me. So he would say, it's 1976, it's a bicentennial, which he created this Horizon program for. And he would say, I have this alternative energy source we've developed at Pine Gap. We're no longer at the mercy of the Arabs and the oil paradigm. We can now move forward. I want the Congress and the Senate to lift the thing so I can preside over a third term. That story, that aspect of it makes a lot of sense to me. So yes, I think there's something to that. Miss Olivia.
Okay, I'm going to pepper you with a few questions.
Okay.
Malentique wants to know, did Dixon implicate LBJ or work with him?
She didn't have a lot to say about LBJ. I feel like that's a period where she's out of favor. And I also feel like being energetically sensitive, that LBJ is such a dark figure, darker than Nixon, who at least had a Quaker background, that I feel that she just would not deal with him. He probably seemed like the devil incarnate to her. And, considering how he acted in the Kennedy case, he probably was. But yeah, that's a great question.
Okay,
wow.
J.J. Lancey, did Jeane Dixon predict Nixon's Watergate problems?
Well, it's interesting because she stood by him quite a bit. And in this book, she says some remarkable things about Nixon, about how great he is. But she doesn't say he's my friend. She just says President Nixon did this great thing and this great thing. And that's it, Call to Glory, by the way. That's the Jeane Dixon book. Speaks of Jesus and prophecy. And it has a lot of religious overtones when you read this. I mean, expect that. So when you get to the 2020 Armageddon part, you're not too surprised because she sort of set you up for it. But she's done it in kind of a psychic way. But yes, I would say that after he got into those problems, she may have told him about what lay before him. But there's nothing on the record, although I have the actual readout from the Nixon library of her meetings with Nixon. And there are recordings, actually. Some of those recordings have been transcribed of their phone conversations. And I found those interesting, too, because it looks like she does all the talking.
Mm.
Go ahead.
Data relay. Do we know of any connections involving Jeane Dixon and Israel or Israelis? Did you know Uri Geller, for example?
Well, it's interesting.
They would have both been on the Johnny Carson show.
I wouldn't be surprised, but I will say that she tracked a lot of incidents for this terrorist task force that Nixon set up, using her psychic work to see if any diplomats from Israel or America were going to be kidnapped, because they had a lot of these things were in relation to the PLO and the Israeli issue. So she definitely was in the heart, and she definitely, because of her biblical background, felt that Israel, was the Holy Land, and that it would play a big role in the aspects that would lead to World War III, et cetera. But in terms of prominent Israelis that she worked with, it's a good question. There are none coming to mind. Yes.
David Tormina. Did Dixon have any connection with the Bird Machine or Antarctica?
Well, when I went into her past, I found her so close with so many Southern senators, and Byrd being part of that Virginia machine, I wouldn't be surprised. So I think if we go looking for those, we're going to find them. Since I mentioned those tapes, by the way, here's an actual official Nixon presidential materials staff, and it says President's schedule, meeting with Dixon and Woods. And then Woods leads at 12:35, and then from 12:35 to 1:11 p.m. they talk, May 4th, 1971, in the Oval Office. And the notation is the president met with Jeane L. Dixon and Rosemary Woods, but Woods left at 12:35. That's from the Nixon presidential materials staff. So, we know it's on the record, but there it is for all of us to see. See if does that even show up? It does. So those things are undeniable, just like the Jeane Dixon records we brought forward tonight, which are a breakthrough, by the way, because they have not been mentioned and they are just lost and sitting there at the JFK library. The only reason that I came across them was because I was so hardcore on cross-checking the name Dixon that all those letters from James L. Dixon that they must have assumed was just not related to Jeane Dixon, I was able to drill down and find her signature on those. That's the only reason that we even have them in the public domain. Speaking of presidential libraries, this is a Reagan Library topic guide. Are you ready? This is an actual subject matter. They have case files for it. Reagan Library, extraterrestrials and UFOs, unidentified flying objects. An overview of the entire Reagan presidential collection on extraterrestrials and UFOs. The folders and case files listed on those topics may still have been withdrawn due to Freedom of Information Act restrictions. And I'm sure a lot of them have, but that's the document from the Reagan Library. So do they talk in their own internal circles about the ET issue? You bet. You better believe it. One quick thing, Nixon was getting such a hassle about Jeane Dixon having this influence over him. It was known in certain circles. It had leaked out, but it had been forgotten over time until this reporter had dug up the terrorism task force reports of her visiting. So this one is pretty good. It says, I want to make this perfectly clear. My name is Dixon, not Nixon. And this guy did a whole shtick imitating Nixon and using this Jeane Dixon's name. I thought that was pretty good. And then one more, which is, this is the Time magazine after Rosemary Woods deletes the 18.5 minutes from the tape. Here's something I found out in researching this that I'd never heard before. The 18.5 minute gap is not one whole stretch. It has the impression of being manipulated 9 times, which means start, 4-minute gap, stop, keep going, somewhere else in that gap, stop, keep going. So the 18.5 minutes worth of a gap is not one piece of 18.5 minutes. It's a series of stops and erases. which means the idea that she leaned back and accidentally, caused this to be erased is completely bunk now because of that. But she's very interesting in her own right, and she was, of course, the big liaison to Jeane Dixon. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Bethany Green, did Jeane Dixon say any of her past lives?
No, it's interesting. She believed in reincarnation, and so I think that's quite remarkable. But she herself didn't do it. What's interesting is Ruth Montgomery, who was her biographer. Where's that little Ruth Montgomery book?
It's underneath all of these papers right over here.
Yes, gracias. Nicely done. You can find a needle in a haystack if Olivia's around. Look at this. This is the book, A World Beyond Ruth Montgomery. This book and Aliens Among Us. She is Jeane Dixon's, she was her close confidant, and then she was also her biographer as well, with her own very unusual story about being the only woman allowed to cover FDR's funeral. So she was quite a trailblazer herself. Interesting side note on Ruth Montgomery. So because of Jeane Dixon, she becomes familiar with Arthur Ford, who does work, but he's like a medium where he channels, relatives and dead relatives, and they come through, and he gives this mediumistic advice, and then he dies. So one day Ruth Montgomery is writing, and he starts writing through her, and he writes an entire book. So she writes an entire book as Arthur Ford. It's quite remarkable. But in her books, and remember, she was very deep politically, friends with Rosemary Wood, just like Woods as Dixon was. She writes Aliens Among Us. She's the one who invents the term walk-in for when a person who is a normal person gets, there's an ET entity that they've agreed to host, and that ET entity can go out and, run through them and be a politician or whatever it happens to be. And that term walk-in, which we heard a lot about more in the 90s and the 2000s, that was something that came out of her work. So I would say her stuff was very advanced and ahead of its time on the alien front. Yes, Ms. Olivia.
Okay, so Bethany Green wanted to know, do you think Jeane Dixon might have been used for remote viewing? Could she have known English One?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I bet that she was used, but by the very top echelon. Remember, the FBI used her, which was pretty interesting, too, because we know the FBI didn't really see eye to eye with Nixon. So you have to wonder about the tension there between the two, especially with J. Edgar Hoover, who personally engaged her to do different types of missions for the FBI. The remote viewing program comes about in the late 60s and early 70s through Russell Targ and SRI. And there's another guy involved who we hear a lot about now, Hal Puthoff. And the program, the CIA gets the upper hand on the program, and they fund it because they're getting results. And the CIA aspect comes through Russell. Not through Russell Targ, but through Hal Puthoff. Russell Targ is this kind of physicist who has a background in spiritualism and these other areas. He's far more familiar with it. So they developed some of those people like Uri Geller and all the rest of it. I would feel with such access that Nixon had with Dixon, that's the kind of program that he would invite her to have input on. But I haven't seen anything on the record about it. It's a great question. Wow. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here in X-Series episode now 80. This is a landmark one with a lot of breakthrough information. And we are going deep on Jeane Dixon, psychic at the White House, Moon Township, and its unusual habit of attracting presidents, especially when President Ford went there as his first public appearance after pardoning Nixon. Is a big message to this, and we're finding that whole Armageddon 2020 wave and the symbolism of it is really hardcore. So we're going to take a couple more questions, and then we're going to wrap it up for tonight. Yes.
Bethany Green just wanted to add that she had a dream and told Pilate to protect Jesus. That was the past life.
Oh,
so,
interesting. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, wide awake. Did Dixon mention Planet X?
Well, she talked about the incredible things that we were going to find. And we know that when Nixon was giving Merritt, this is what Merritt told me, that when he gave him this letter, he read it to him. And the letter said, "We have obtained subjects from Planet X." So there's the X steganography right in the heart of the Merritt story. That's where Planet X comes up in relation to that. But I would say that there's no question, if you go through Dixon's material, she's always talking about the UFO aspect and the off-world civilizations aspect. It's a big piece, especially in 1977. Yes.
Okay. So, Kate Catanella, what was Jeane's last prediction?
Well, it's interesting. She made a series of them. Her very last one probably was her own death, but she made predictions about us using alternative food and energy sources. And it'd be interesting to see if those came true. I ran across an unusual article where someone was peppering her for information about people in the future. And the article was from 1986, and it asked her about Trump. And but the question was slanted to be, will Trump run for something like mayor of New York? And she said, he's one to watch, but don't watch for him running for mayor of New York. So she gave the hint that his political future was coming. And I haven't found anything that shows that she went further with that. But we know in that unusual letter that Nixon wrote to Trump, he says, "I predict." And it's an odd thing to use. It says, I predict you're going to be successful if you run for president. For Nixon to say predict is weird. You have to wonder, since it was his close friend, Jeane Dixon, that's probably who predicted it. Now, if we take a quick look, that's the letter. And it's from Richard Nixon up here, and it's to Donald. And it says, "Dear Donald, I did not see the program." This was Trump on the Donahue show, which was a big hit at the time because he was speaking his mind. And it's from December 21st, 1987. Remember, Nixon and Trump become great friends. And Trump makes Nixon move into New York City so he can have greater access to him and spend all this time with him. And they do fundraisers and other things together, as we've shown so many times in this program. He goes, "As you can imagine, she is an expert on politics." He's talking about Mrs. Nixon, supposedly. And he says, "She predicts that whenever you decide to run from office, you will be a winner. With warm regards, Richard Nixon." It's interesting to point out that Trump and his big spiritual positive thinking leader, Norman Vincent Peale was also Richard Nixon's great personal power coach. So they have that connection. And just to round out the Trump aspect, of course, this story, Trump, a display letter from Nixon in Oval Office. And he put the letter I just showed you now on his wall. Now, I want to bring up a couple of things briefly about Trump. One of them is when we brought forward the picture of him with Nixon and John Connally, and when we brought forward the story of Trump's uncle working under Vannevar Bush at MIT, they just were not on the radar. And so this is part of the story and why we're able to get our hands on it. And I like being the conduit for these kinds of things. It's not an ego thing to say we brought it forward. I just mean that in the X series, we have this ability to get our hands on those stealth archives. A lot of these things are there, as we've proven. Even tonight with the Jeane Dixon information that was hanging out at the JFK library. What about the information brought forward on Ernest Hemingway that was hanging out at the JFK library? These things are there. We have the ability to move forward and get them. And that's exciting for me, and I think it gives us a better picture. But here, obviously, if Trump is displaying the letter that Nixon wrote to him saying, run for office, it's that significant. Otherwise, the things you put in your Oval Office when you're the president are pretty significant. JFK put the coconut that saved him and his crew, and that he sent a message through. they put things in there that are significant to such a level that they have to look at it every day and it reminds them who they are. That's what Trump did with Nixon's letter. That's why that's a big story. Yes. One more question, Miss Olivia.
Okay. David Tormina. DJ, it seems that JFK and Nixon both failed in their plans to bring the secret technology to the public. Could Dixon's Armageddon actually be if Trump goes ahead and does it?
Well, it's interesting. I would say, it's interesting when you look at Kennedy because he set up the battle against the CIA, which is crucial. And the society and the setup, the power structure wasn't ready for him to do this. And so the CIA ultimately and the deep state removed Kennedy because they didn't want him to do that and a number of other things. But nonetheless, by holding the world together during the Cuban Missile Crisis and not getting us into a nuclear war, he gave us the opportunity. So in a way, he was successful. Nixon is kind of viciously removed if you really think about it, because these forces used to be really behind Nixon. So the way that they disposed of him is really to take him down in the public eye and the public imagination. You're right on the surface, which is that Nixon was and Kennedy were defeated from moving this X-Tech, the UFO file information, out into the public. Trump has the information and the knowledge from his uncle, but he's also surrounded by a lot of hawks. So, when they made space a warfighting domain, it was a great reversal. Making the Space Force is his attempt to get his hands on the UFO file. There's no question about that. But the problem is, when you weaponize space, you violate everything that the space program has stood for. So if he's listening to hawks who say, hey, you can have a boondoggle in space and make lots of money there, that's a very different thing than Kennedy was going out in space to do. So I think Trump has the opportunity to bring these things forward, especially if he has the knowledge from his uncle, who, remember, we brought forward, was Vannevar Bush's protege. Vannevar Bush, according to physicist Robert Sarbarker, who's been eliminated from Wikipedia, he said Vannevar Bush ran the UFO redevelopment project. He ran the UFO file. So if Trump is his protege, and Trump is, John Trump, Professor John Trump was his protege, and he was the one who they sent to pick up Tesla's papers based on Vannevar Bush's recommendation, then you have to give Trump a lot more heft, and it may explain, as I had a conversation with Joseph Farrell about this, it may explain exactly why we have this situation of freaking out and doing anything, even to make themselves look like idiots to get rid of Trump. So you hope very well that he could come through with this. Unfortunately, I'm seeing a lot of hawks and a lot of neocons around Trump, and I'm thinking that some force needs to put him back on the straight and narrow, because if he goes sideways, it's going to be a disaster. Maybe even a bigger disaster than the Democrats. So you have to be careful. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I just wanted to follow up with this. Judy Carr says, is Nixon's formula more about special material rather than energy itself? Space program needed to manufacture it, and Bigelow trying to be the first to get it out?
Interesting. I see Bigelow as a strange figure in this, and I don't think that he's high level enough to get an alternative energy source out. It seems like he's being used more to commercialize the UFO aspect. He has this idea for hotels in space, which is a good idea, but it's not a deep research idea. What's interesting to me is what they have, from what I can tell in the UFO file with the X-Tech, is this effect that I call apotheum in the show. It's APOTHEUM. And this is something that's been recorded through these mystery schools. And it is, in effect, it's like a reality distortion field. And this is one of the reasons why the mystery schools locked up the technology back then. And then when it began to resurface, public mystery schools like Theosophy, with John Keely's work, kept it down. They they didn't want it to get out to the public because, as they were proven right with World War I and World War II, we were irresponsible. The minute the technology upped its game, we started dropping atomic bombs. So there's an issue there with Apotheum, which is this is part of the wall of secrecy because they don't understand everything about how Apotheum works. And a quick example of Apotheum, you hear about a UFO case, people report missing time. That's a physics effect. They report power outages. Their car won't run, or things run backwards. Plants won't grow where these things land. It has a reality distortion effect to the point where there's no gravity, and people walk through walls and things like that. It's like the Philadelphia experiment on steroids. So when you get into that level, you're into something that they maintain lethal secrecy over, and that's the whole Ex-Protect group that we have shown in this program operates. That's how they operate. The group of Ex-Protect, which includes people like Kennedy, Thomas Townsend Brown, they want to help the culture to integrate this and move it forward, the knowledge of the ET part, but it's the technology and how to roll it out. And they're so advanced now beyond what we know about, and this is part of the reason for the kind of schizophrenic relationship the public is having with the leadership. So this is where we find ourselves, basically. And with that, I have one final shot for everyone, which is this picture when Bush and Reagan were running against each other, which I think sums up their relationship later, but that's pretty good. Reagan not looking very happy, and Bush pleased with himself. And remember, when Reagan is pushed now to put Bush on his ticket, and he absolutely can't accept anyone else. At first, they try to force Ford on him, who was the loser president. That's a weird idea. But then they force Bush on him, and he has to take him. And then within 3 months of his inauguration, there's an assassination attempt by someone who's a family friend of the Bushes. So they almost used the same playbook that they had used on RFK and JFK. Quite interesting. They didn't get away with it this time, but let's face it, Bush did a lot of damage behind the scenes. Everyone, it's great. I do want to mention that if there are people who are familiar with Moon Township and the issues there or have any stories in relation to it, please do send us that information at info@darkjournalist.com. There's more to come on that story. And thank you very much for being with us. It's been a great night to have you here. I will let Olivia take one more question.
Okay, well, Carmina had a good follow-up. Wouldn't Armageddon be something like an ex-reveal warfare situation?
Yeah, well, it's interesting when you think of it that way. The idea is then that you're suggesting what would happen is the advanced technology would get out and become an uncontrollable situation. It's possible, I always go back to Reagan and Gorbachev going into Reykjavik, and that what happens is when they're trading information back and forth, they go down to something called a zero option. And that is the elimination of all nuclear weapons everywhere. Meaning that they had something else to supplement that, because obviously if you got rid of all your nuclear weapons, you lose your superiority and everything else. So, but they discussed it, and they almost came to an agreement about it. It was SDI Star Wars where they weren't able to do it. So that tells us that they had it refined to a point back then in 1987. So that's some 30 years ago. We can only imagine where they are with it now. So do they have it? Do they have that ability to bring it out? The Trump administration recently got us out of the INF treaty with the Russians, which is a terrible thing to do because it was Reagan and Gorbachev that had negotiated it. So therefore, I would say that that is going in the wrong direction. They're building into the nuclear thing again. And then, the Russians are developing these incredibly hypersonic missiles, which can go anywhere in 10 minutes, that kind of thing. And that's a nuclear arms, it's like a new nuclear arms race. So for some reason, this other piece has been left behind or shelved. So therefore, it looks like the greater danger is reverting to these old weapons, and that the X technology, in fact, would solve problems. So it would be hard to think of it as associated with Armageddon, but certainly it can be misused in that fashion. There's no question about it. It's a great question. Everyone, thank you so much. I have to do a couple of shout outs.
Did you ever get around to answering the question, who is Trump's Jeane Dixon?
Norman Vincent Peale was
Okay.
the setup for that.
Mhm.
Whoever he's using now, it's a good question. And we don't know because they keep that stuff really tight. But I think it would be worthwhile to see who's visiting the White House. And wow, what a fantastic series of questions. Great from the ideas room tonight. Exceptional. And I'll do a couple of shout outs here. Of course, David, those were great questions. And I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you, Kate. Grandma Tippy Toes, thank you for being with us. Kontiki Man. Miguel, thank you for joining us. It's terrific to have you here. And Stefan, of course, always doing great work on Twitter too. Najat, excellent to see you out there and excellent questions. We will see you all next Friday.
I have a lot of super chatters to thank.
Oh, yes, let's start with that.
Adam Riddle,
Yes.
James Belch, Simon Christopher, Leshat, Debbie McAdoo, Sam R., Gil and Joy R., Christine Taggart, Deborah Holmes, Mike D., Doyle Wayne, Eurythmias Fun, Wayne Peak, and Wide Awake. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you. Really appreciate the support of the show, and it makes all the difference for sure. And for our subscribers and supporters across the board, well, we couldn't do it without you, so thank you. And if you want to become a subscriber to Dark Journalist, go to darkjournalist.com. And we've made it really affordable for you to get on board. Remember to sign up for the newsletter. And also, you can get it at darkjournalist.com. So make sure that you're on board because we have exciting things coming up for you in the coming weeks and months, and some incredible guests coming up for February, and the events coming for the spring just off the charts. So make sure you're signed up with us. And thank you for all that. Lee, we see you out there. Thank you very much. Scarlet Fire. Nish is out there. Bethany Green. Wow, a great crowd tonight. We will see you all next week. And remember, this piece about Moon Township and the Mason-Dixon stones, the boundary stones, is going to be a piece here in the X series going forward. So we're not done with that by a long shot. But we made some history here tonight with the Jeane Dixon documents at the JFK Library. So that's a new one, and we're going to bring you many more of these. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Tricky Vicky. I somehow you didn't make the list, but thank you.
Hey, I have something to tell Tricky Vicky, which is now the way that the Google algorithm is, when you search for Dark Journalist, you get Tricky Vicky's playlist of Dark Journalists. So good job. I guess Google likes you. Whatever you're doing, you got the right touch. And we will see you all next week. And thank you, Dimensions and Beyond, Carly, of course, Gigi Young, and it's great to see everyone out there. We will see you all. Breach 1, 2, 3. It's great to see you. And Miss Olivia, you get the last word.
I'm trying not to cough.
Wasn't that good time? We'll see you all. It's time for a taco.
Exactly.
We'll see you all next week.
Thanks, everybody.
But not Taco Bell.
Homemade tacos.
Enchilada. And of course, it's end broadcast, but it never really ends. You know that.